Japanimation Station.
Hello and welcome to Japanimation Station, an anime podcast brought to you by the folks at the Weekly Stuff Podcast. I am Sean Chapman.
And I'm Jonathan Lack.
And we are here once again to dive into the wild and wacky world of anime. This week on the show, we are continuing our journey through Kata no Kyoukai, or the Garden of Sinners, for our second season. Ufotable Moon Works. We're looking at all the Ufotable adaptations of Type Moon material. We have already covered the first 4 movies in our first 2 episodes, and I saw fit, because this is the longest movie we've covered so far. It's one of the longest of all the films, and it is widely regarded as the best of the movies. I thought, let us make sure that I have seen this movie before. I was like, we should make this its own episode. Jonathan, you have now seen Paradox Spiral, the 5th Kata no Kyoukai movie. Do you think I made the right choice?
God, yes. I have absolutely no idea how we would have fit this into one episode. Like, fit this into with other movies. Just like, it's too big. It is too much of its own thing. It is one of the best movies I have ever seen. We are recording this in November of 2022, and I recently put out a list of, the first time I've ever done this, of the top 100 movies of all time, according to me, just like using my whatever professional acumen I have, what I would call the 100 best. Not necessarily my favorite, but best. And you can go find that on jonathanlack.com or elsewhere. But I will say, if I had seen this movie before making that list, this would have been in, at a minimum, serious contention for that top 100. It is that kind of good. And I haven't even seen the rest of the Garden of Sinners. Honestly, this is so good that if the series ended here, I'd be like, that was a great experience. I don't need any more. It's that fucking great. This is a fucking landmark of animation, I think it is fair to say.
Yeah, I mean, I've obviously seen the movie before, but rewatching it last night, I was completely bowled over by it again, even knowing what the movie is. But I think partially because it's my first time rewatching it, like, I have a lot more experience with, like, the Type Moon stuff in general. So this movie gets into a lot more of the, it gets into, like, it sort of flirts with the metaphysics of the Nasuverse more heavily. And it gets into stuff. We have some proper nouns we'll talk about in this episode. That'll be fun to get into. That will be important when you get to Fate as well. I think some of that stuff allowed me to see other sides of the movie and how it fits into a bigger picture with the rest of Type Moon. But I think there's also, I had kind of forgotten just how intricate the movie is in its structure, in its design, and how thoroughly it explores its core themes of, like, duality, of that kind of yin and yang concept that is here, like a motif that is in all of Kata no Kyoukai, and like boundaries and limits and those things that are motifs we get through the whole series. But this movie takes all those ideas and isn't just exploring it in the narrative, it's exploring it through the structure of the film itself. And one thing that was interesting is that it, like this movie does as a movie, a lot of things that the book does in its first chapter through literature, this finds a way to replicate that cinematically. I think is even more successful as an artistic project in exploring those ideas and expressing them through, in this case, cinematic language. So yeah, I think you're 100% right that this would be easily in contention for, especially on a craftsmanship level, one of the best movies ever made, because it is doing things cinematically and using that to reinforce its narrative that is truly remarkable.
I think particularly in editing, I think there's a lot to talk about here. I'm curious if you have any thoughts. This is the most intricate piece of editing I've ever seen in animation.
Yes.
I can't immediately think of another animated work that has this intricate an editorial structure, and I would definitely put this movie, for me, up there with, like, the Soviet masterworks like, Battleship Potemkin and Man with a Movie Camera, kind of the early editorial masterworks. Thelma Schoonmaker on Raging Bull, the Martin Scorsese movie. Godfather 2. King Hu's Reigning in the Mountain. No, it's Legend in the Mountain. There's got 2 mountain movies, but Legend in the Mountain is the one where the woman is playing the drum, and that is doing these, like, editorial things. And just, like, the movies that I kind of hold in high regard as, like, the best examples of, like, intricate editing for a fucking purpose, and this movie has that in spades, to the degree that one thought I had watching this movie throughout was, this is so cinematic, and cinematic in, like, editing is one of the most cinematic pieces of cinema, right? And it is so visual. There are whole scenes in this that are so purely visual and auditorial and editorial that I was like, how does this exist in book form? I'm really curious what this was as a light novel and what Ufotable is adding to it, what they're changing, because I would not have, if I didn't know ahead of time, I wouldn't guess that this was based on a book or pre-existing material. It's too cinematic and its own thing,
Yeah, and fortunately I haven't had the time to get all the way through to this part in the book yet. I did pick up the book again, but I'm only partway through chapter 4, because it takes me a very long time to read things in Japanese. And this is easily, by far, the longest of the chapters. In my digital version, which the page numbers don't matter because it's digital, so like the font changes, and I read with comically large font in Japanese because it's impossible for me to read kanji otherwise. But this is like 500 pages. And the next longest chapter is chapter 7, which is 300 pages. Most of the chapters are like 100 pages. So this is the bulk of the book. It is almost the entire second quote-unquote book, if you split it out into the 3 books that were released. It is chapter 4, which is like 80 pages with my font, and it is this, which is like 500. So it is by far the most substantial piece in the literature, and I kind of thumbed through it, digitally speaking, because I had the same thought as you of like, what the fuck is this in the book? I think what's interesting is just glancing through it, obviously can't like speak to it in detail. A lot of the stuff they're doing cinematically is not necessarily there so much in the book version, at least from what I could tell. Obviously some of the structural stuff, like the 3 large parts of the movie, there's kind of, it's split into 3 parts. The opening section with like Tomoe and Shiki, then there's a big middle section that's mostly Kokuto and Toko, and then there's a final section where it like Kokuto and Tomoe intersect, and then it all comes together to the home stretch. That structure is very much in the book. Some of the like kind of chronological stuff seems to be there, but it is not, as far as I could tell, doing anything to try to create that really complex sense of disorientation and mirroring of scenes together and all of that. It's not necessarily trying to do that as much. And so I think part of what this movie is doing is looking at some of the stylistic things that other chapters, particularly chapter 1 in the book, did, that the movie version abandoned, because I don't think it would have worked to do the first movie that way. And it's saying, how do we, because all of the motifs and the themes and the ideas are consistent across all of Kado no Kyoukai, there's no reason why you couldn't translate and take some of those ideas and put them in this section of the story that fits better for the way the movies work. And that's what this feels like to me. They said, let's take those experimental ideas and how you mix up the chronology, you throw scenes together and juxtapose scenes in complex ways that disorient the viewer, but also give them like this ability through that juxtaposition to start putting different kind of pieces together and have that match the thematic elements of the story. Let's take all of those ideas and move that into movie 5 and match that in movie 5. That also goes deeper into the yin yang motif that is there throughout the rest of the piece, but is kind of most prominent here. And that's, to me, again, just having glanced through the book and not read the whole sequence, that's what it feels like it is doing as a piece of adaptation. And I think it's really cool that they're thinking about how you adapt the full scope of the books, but move and alter things and use those adaptational choices where they most apply for a movie version rather than where they applied best in the book version.
That's really interesting to me, and that makes a lot of sense and speaks to, just how smart an adaptation this is. Another thing I was thinking is that we talked a lot about this in the previous episode, that when you get to the end of part 4 of the Hollow Shrine, the 4th film, you feel like, okay, the table is set, we've been out of order so far, it's been confusing in a good way, but confusing, and now, like, not everything makes sense, obviously. I don't think anything in this world will ever fully make sense, because that's not the point. But you do feel like, okay, I know who Toko is, I know Kokuto and Shiki's relationship, as well as, like, they know it, frankly. And I know sort of the general chronology of this thing, what the general, like, kind of structure of this story is. I feel like we're on sort of solid footing, and the table is set, and now we're going to move into the next phase of the story. And it feels like this film, Paradox Spiral, is so intricately designed to zig where you expect it to zag. Instead of sort of taking that, we've set the table, and now we're going to go straight forward from there, they don't go straight forward at all. The first 45 minutes of this movie, the first act, Tomoe is 100% the protagonist, and Shiki is there, but you're not in Shiki's POV, and with all the stuff that is being done out of chronology, with the very fast montages, with the crazy editing, you are very much thrown for a loop. This was, I think, by far the most challenging of the movies so far. Yes. And I don't mean I mean challenging in a good way. Like, you are on your toes, actively thinking. For me, knowing we were doing a review of this, it's a 2-hour movie. It probably took me 3 hours to get through, just taking notes and pausing and rewinding and getting screenshots and taking dialogue down and things like that, because I wanted to have my head around it if I'm going to get on a podcast and talk about it. And all of the other ones have had challenges here and there, but I think I was maybe expecting a bigger version of what we got in the 3rd film, Remaining Sense of Pain, which is the most straightforward of the episodes so far. It's the one that is the most clearly like case of the week, beginning to end. It's not straightforward by the standards of any other work of art, but by the standards of Kara no Kyoukai, relatively straightforward. This is not that at all. I mean, a whole year passes in the background in this movie, and things kind of shift in the background, and we're introduced to an entire other side of the world we did not know exist, with Toko and her magic friends, who are not really friends anymore, and all of that stuff. I mean, it could not throw more at the viewer if it tried, and that is part of what is so dizzyingly brilliant about it.
Yeah, and it's something where, like, so we're recording this podcast in the evening. Normally we record in the afternoons, and I watched the movie as I normally do when we do movies. I watched it the night before we do the podcast, and I kind of wish I just watched it earlier today, because I feel like I lost my whole day today, because the only thing I've been doing is thinking about this movie. Because I was like, because it's like all bottled up, and I needed to do a podcast on it. I'm like, fuck it, what the fuck did I even do today? All I did was sit around and think about Paradox Spiral, because there's something so kind of hypnotizing and mesmerizing about this movie, and I think it has such a complexity to its themes, and the kind of motif work it does is kind of almost, I think of them almost more as motifs, because it is these like recurring complex symbols and ideas that build and evolve on one another. And there's so much of that in this movie, and particularly the middle sequence to me is the most complex, with Kokuto, where it is this incredibly intricate series of interlocking scenes where there are multiple similar scenes that have happened in this period of time that you're experiencing, but you're experiencing them out of order. And there's like, how in movies, I don't know if this is the terminology you film people use, but in movies you've got like inter-scene cutting and intra-scene cutting, right? Is how I would refer to it, like cutting between scenes and cutting within scenes.
We would also call that like macro and micro, or structural and momentary, but yes, that is a big idea in film studies.
Yeah, and I think one of the crazy things that this movie does in that whole middle stretch is it completely blurs the line between what is cutting within this scene and what is cutting to a different scene, because you have multiple versions of basically the same scene or similar scenes happening, like Toko and Kokuto visit the lobby of the mansion multiple times. Kokuto goes to Shiki's house and tries the door and finds it locked multiple times. Like, they have a conversation with Cornelius Alba, multiple times. There's lots of different sequences that there are, like conversations they have in the office. There are multiple versions of those scenes that have happened over the course of time that this movie takes place. And it will cut within a scene to a moment that is from one of those other versions of the scene. And they will do that with like no warning. It will happen so rapidly. It will happen multiple times within a scene. And there's something so powerful about that to me. And the one thing I was curious about, Jonathan, have you ever seen anything else that does this kind of thing, that really experiments with that? How do you blur the lines between, are you looking even at the same scene anymore? Or are you looking at a similar scene taking place in a different time frame with a different context, and you're moving fluidly one between the other in the same way one would normally cut to different shots within the same sequence?
I'd have to think on that. I mean, the closest I would say is like true avant-garde film. Like stuff like, I think you could make an argument for like Maya Deren's Meshes in the Afternoon or At Land, but they're narrative, but they're very oblique, so they don't have the same sense of there being a continuity in the way this is a continuity,
yes,
but it is being presented discontinuously to the degree that this movie does it, and with the sheer degree of, I want to use the word playfulness, and maybe that feels wrong for something this dark, but like it is editorially playful. It's very structured, but it's, also very open and willing to experiment with that. Yeah, no, I have trouble thinking what else would do that fluidly. There are, in sort of the early days of like institutionalized film studies in like the 60s and 70s, you would sometimes get these monographs that people would write. A monograph just means a book on one subject about like taking... Often it would be like the Soviet masterworks, like Battleship Potemkin, and you would take Potemkin and you would go shot by shot just to break down the editing, and that's a whole book going through the basic editorial pattern of that movie. It's very rewarding, and I've often thought about different movies, man, I would love to do that with this movie or this movie. I've often thought about that with Yoshiyuki Tomino. I think like Reconquista in G would probably be, before seeing this, I would say the most interesting editing I've ever seen in anime. But that is still fundamentally continuity editing. This is something else. I would love, if I had like the time and money, like funding, to do the book just on the editing of this movie, because I feel like that would be a fascinating exercise. Because it's exactly what you're talking about. You wouldn't just be talking about the relationships between shots, but you would be saying like, okay, the 3 shots in this cut, like they belong to 3 different periods that are actually relating in this way, but one of the main languages this movie uses graphic matches, so it's constantly drawing between, like, someone will open a door. This is a frequent cut in this movie. Someone will open a door to an apartment, and then like another door, like a car door, will open, and those are not continuous in the sense of continuity editing, but they have a graphic match between them. There's all sorts of stuff that, like, it is blending a lot of different major styles of editing.
Yeah, and it takes really powerful advantage of like some things that animation can do very trivially that live action would struggle with, which is being able to replicate exact shots exactly, right? So like particularly unless you're on like a hyper-controlled set in live action, it is very difficult to reproduce the exact same shot at a different point in time, because a person's hair is going to look different, their costume will be in a slightly different position. If you're outside, the time of day changes, like, things in the background will change without your control. Whereas with animation, you can just layer different elements onto the exact same shot. And that's one of the things this movie uses to like laser precision, is by reusing what is like oftentimes 95% the exact same shot you saw 5 minutes ago in a similar scene. But like adding in one other element, like, oh, in this shot, Kokuto is lying on the ground in the background and there's the blood on the wall. And then it will cut to a wide shot and he's not there anymore. You're going to find out in 10 minutes, why was he there in this shot, that you were seeing a different version of the same scene in that one shot that was giving you, again, this kind of duality thing that you get throughout the whole movie. And that's kind of stuff that animation can really do effectively, because you can just reuse this exact same shot and then add in this element later, or add in like the different cars that are parking outside and stuff like that at the end of the movie. There you can very easily reuse those same shots. I think that's one thing that I really love about the movie, is it feels so efficient in how it goes about its very complex structural design.
Yes, there are whole parts of the first act of this movie, with the Tomoe part, where they literally have like the cell layer. Today they don't use cells, but you know what I mean. The character animation layer stay the same, and then they take out the background and put another background in. So you have like Shiki moving. There isn't a cut, but Shiki is now in a different place in time, and they do stuff like that. It's fascinating. It's incredible. I think the rhythms of this movie feel much more like music to me than they do film or literature or other things that I think of as like straightforwardly narrative, even in comparison to the other Kara no Kyoukai films. Like, and when I say that, like you earlier said, maybe motif is a better word to use than theme. I'm looking at my notes. My first note in my notes here, Sean, is motif of turning keys. And like, that's something you see a lot. And I do think the word motif is good because that is a word that comes to us from music primarily. And I think when you think of music and you think of themes and motifs in music, there are some cases like, sort of the Wagnerian tradition that kind of survives in film scoring where themes do kind of have a one-to-one connection to an idea. Like every time, you hear the Ring theme in Howard Shore's Lord of the Rings, this implies Sauron and the evil and that sort of thing. But in a lot of music, themes and motifs exist and they don't necessarily have like the composer wrote down, okay, this theme means this, and every time I use it, I'm developing this specific idea. It's a lot more emotive than that, right? And I think this movie is doing that, where you could definitely put into words a lot of what it's doing with duality and yin-yang and that, but I also think it's not necessarily inviting that. I think it's much more interested in kind of the musicality of these ideas being put together, and I think the final sequence of the movie, which really goes hard in on this duality between Tomoe and Shiki, is the best example of that, of like, I could break down what that means shot by shot, and maybe we will, but like, it so gets the idea across visually and emotionally that you feel the idea, you don't have to verbalize it.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you, because I think like the things I would compare it to is either music, or it makes me feel like it reminds me of poetry more than it does like a novelistic structure where there's something about the way it is reusing these like scenes or matching scenes in this way that feels like it's cinematic rhyming, right? You're using this sort of structure of similarity to juxtapose different things or remind you and bring up similar ideas that have existed somewhere else in this piece through the use of this like recurring similarity. And that's something that poets they'll use rhyming or other kinds of literary like aesthetic structures of literature to connect ideas across a whole piece, and use that kind of repetition, or here we're using this similar kind of alliteration, whatever it is. And I think there's something about that I feel in this movie as well, that it is very resistant to you trying to collapse all of its like ideas and meaning into a single statement or a single interpretation. Like, and obviously we will like talk about our various interpretations and what it made us feel and stuff, because I think it wants you to explore those ideas. But I think this is, as is true of most of Nasu's stuff, and I think particularly true of Kara no Kyoukai in general, is very resistant to you trying to collapse all of its like ideas into a single like thing, a statement, a statement of intent, or a single thematic project. It's a lot more sort of complex than that, and it's a lot more kind of it's a lot more fluid than that, than something that you can just kind of compress down to a single idea. There's something about that stylistically that's particularly about this movie is impressive to me, because it is so hard to get your head around it. It is so hard to try to like kind of find solid footing throughout the whole middle section of the movie, not in a way that's bad, but in a way that's like, it feels like you're drowning in the film in a very effective way.
Yeah, there's the poetry example makes me think of, there are, if you look at like the writings of Sergei Eisenstein, the Soviet filmmaker who made Potemkin and Strike, October, and kind of is the most notable kind of proponent of montage editing, Soviet montage editing. He would sometimes have the idea of like, shots you should use shots as like building blocks and come back to them, and like in that kind of poetic sense, almost like you're building a vocabulary with the camera that you then construct in the editing. And this movie is fundamentally montage editing. It is fundamentally constructivist editing. When I use the word, when I teach film theory, I have a slide for my students, and I go through the word montage in film studies is confusing because it has three broad meanings. It is just the word for editing in most of the world, because that's the French word for editing, and France and America are kind of the two countries where cinema originates and then goes out through the world. There is the modern sense of montage of like Rocky running up the Philadelphia steps, where you compress time in one place and you have music over it. But then there is the Soviet montage, which is the idea that shots on their own don't have meaning. It's all about the relations between the shots, and the relations between the shots create bigger ideas than the shots on their own, usually in a sort of either not continuity editing purpose or a hyper continuity editing purpose of, the edits are going to convey an idea bigger than just what you see in the images. And this movie is doing that through this deconstruction of time, right? And so it is fundamentally that kind of project, although not for like a stridently political didactic means as you would get in Potemkin or something.
Yeah, because that's the other side of this movie that's, like, fantastic, is that it is doing all this, like, insane structural shit that, like, if you're a film nerd, is going to light your goddamn brain on fire, because you're like, oh my god, the editing in this fucking movie.
Yes.
But then also, it's like you get sick wizard fights, and you get, like, what is kind of, to me, the prototype of the big Kimetsu no Yaiba action scenes, in terms of the Ufotable stuff we've seen, that obviously they will continue to develop this. I realized when I was, like, preparing some stuff for this podcast, that, like, because we're doing all the Kata no Kyoukai stuff together, we're doing it slightly out of sequence because movie 8 was made after Fate Zero, but it would be tedious to try to separate those. But we're going to get to see then movie 8. Okay, we get these experimental, like, particularly here, these action 3D shots that you get, 2 big sequences with Shiki in this movie that do some of that camera stuff. And then in movie 8, you will see, how quickly they evolve those techniques into what is much more recognizably what you get in Kimetsu no Yaiba. But you get all that here too, and it's got some incredible action stuff, and it's got, fucking gore up the wazoo. I had kind of forgotten about how gory this movie is in the home stretch.
This is a bloody movie.
I remembered some of it, but some of the details had been lost on me over time. So it still has, like, this kind of more crowd pleaser element to it as well. And I think that's kind of the magic of a lot of Nasu's stuff to me, is that it can balance this, like, very heady ideas, very, like, complex structural things, very intricate, weird themes that make you kind of question tropes and things like that. And then at the same time, you get, like, this is, like, the coolest sword fight you have ever seen in anything ever. Or, like, in terms of the visual novel stuff, even if you cut out, like, the Ufotable contribution, it's like the action and how it's described and implemented in the light novels for Kata no Kyoukai, or like the fight between Fujino and Shiki at the end of Kata no Kyoukai Volume 3 is fucking awesome in the book. But then also in the visual novel, the action sequences are amazing in Fate Stay Night. So it's like, it's able to, I think, serve both camps really effectively. That you can just get your sort of fun, action, crazy anime storyline stuff, but then also it activates this sort of other part of your brain as well if you're into that. That's part of, like, the magic of these kinds of projects to me.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you brought up the action stuff, because this is, as impressive as episodes 1 through 4 of this film series are, this movie feels like it is a leap. Like, it is like... Yes. There are, like, good, like, proto-Ufotable stuff in those first 4 that are very impressive, and especially for the time they came out in, holy shit. And then you get to this, and, like, there are several sequences I wrote about in my notes, but there is one near the end where the camera just goes in with Shiki as she is moving around fighting the puppets. And they are able to maintain the, like, planar anime sense of the characters and the backgrounds. There isn't, like, an obvious, this thing over here has become CGI. It just feels like the camera somehow came off of the mount that it would be in for an animation, like, setup, and just went into the animation and flew around inside it. And it boggles my mind today, and I've seen them do even more complex versions of this, but there's something about seeing it in sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4, and now 5, seeing them just snap that into focus, and you just feel like you can see, moments like, Rengoku's big rush at the end of, Mugen Train, or some of the stuff in the final episodes of Season 2 of Kimetsu no Yaiba, and it's like, you can just draw a straight line from here to there.
Yes, because it is specifically some of the action stuff at the end of the first part, the Shiki part, which is where you get the big, like, action scene of her fighting all the zombies, and then the end of the movie, which is her fighting the character who I'm going to keep on almost calling Kotomine, because that's the very similar character from Fate, but it is not Kotomine, it's Soden, Araya Soden. Her fight against him. This is where they start innovating on some of the stuff of how much they are blending the 3D, of, like, prototyping the shots with 3D models in a 3D program with the 3D backgrounds, and then using that as reference for the 2D animators. Like this is where they start really implementing those techniques that then become like very like well-worn standards for Ufotable in particular by the time we get to the modern era of animation, and things that other studios are starting to do now as well. But this is where, as far as I know, I believe this is the first time they have ever done that, of where they prototyped the entire shot in 3D first and then implemented the 2D stuff on top of the 3D prototyped shot.
And do you have like sources or like interviews that you've seen of them talking about this?
Yeah, well, I don't have like direct things from them. It's more I have like YouTube videos that have gone in. There is some background, like behind the scenes stuff where you can see the animatics for this sequence.
Okay.
So yes.
Yeah, because this is maybe an off podcast conversation, but like this is the third chapter of my dissertation, or planned third chapter, is about sort of, it's essentially about the Ufotable effect. Like there are other studios that have done it, but the full like synthesis of 3D and 2D, not just kind of the, you get a lot of good like back and forth of an anime that'll have a good 3D scene and then a good primarily 3D scene, primarily 2D scene, but Ufotable just creating kind of a new language by combining them. And I feel like this movie is going to feature prominently in that chapter of my dissertation. This is actually part of why we're doing this as season 2, is just because I'm coming up on writing that, and I was going to be watching all the Ufotable stuff anyway, and we said, time to do it then, if I'm going to watch it anyway. So, this is fascinating stuff. This is stuff I'm going to be spending a lot of time researching and writing about.
Yeah, and it is very fun to revisit this movie now that, like, they've worked on the highest grossing movie in the history of the Japanese box office and stuff, like, because even at the time when I originally watched these was before, like, the Unlimited Blade Works anime came out, because when I played Fate Stay Night, that was before the Fate Zero anime came out. So it's like when I originally watched these was a long time ago. So it's like fun to see like, oh, right, man, Ufotable has gone some fucking places, and I almost kind of forget like how long I have in some version been on the journey with them. Because you go back to this and it's like, it's really crazy to see how much of that style is there in this film.
It's so funny to just think about, like, you talked about this in the first episode, that Kinoko Nasu and Type Moon were a little wary to let anyone else kind of have their baby after the first anime of, what was it, Nishiki, like, or what was it?
Tsukihime.
Tsukihime went wrong. And it's like, man, they couldn't have gotten more of their wildest dreams realized in animation, right? And it makes sense why then, Ufotable just is the go-to person for all of the big projects past that point, because, like, man, what a turnaround from this project almost put us off anime adaptations forever, and then Kara no Kyoukai, this is a landmark in the entire history of anime. Like, it's crazy.
Yeah, and just how perfectly it matches the sensibilities of the source material, right? Like the canniness of taking some of the experimental stuff that existed in the first chapter of the book and moving that structurally here and figuring out how to translate that stuff. I mean, I was pretty disappointed in many ways when I watched the first movie because I had read the book and like was like, oh man, I mean, it's still good, but it doesn't do all these crazy things that the book did. And now all those complaints are gone. Like, I guess I had forgotten how thoroughly this movie does this shit. I'm like, oh no, they were 100% right. Like, this is exactly what you needed to do. You needed to keep that spirit alive, but it would have been so alienating for the movies to have tried to do something like this in the first one. It would be impossible. Like, nobody would fucking get all the way through it. So saving this style and it's like, no, we've got the buy-in. People are like the characters. They're into this world. We're all the way in. Let's put all that crazy experimental structural stuff into also the big meaty middle chapter. That is also like sort of like almost like the first climax of the series of movies, because in many ways this is like wraps up a lot of like nascent story threads from the first few movies, and then we'll get movie 6, which is kind of its own thing, and then movie 7, which pays off all the serial killer stuff from the second movie. So this is like structurally it's like one big climax before you get almost like the denouement in some ways, which is like the last two films. And so then moving all that stuff here, it's just the sensibility to do that and the respect of the source material to be adventurous enough to do that, but still pulling it from the spirit of what the books are doing. Like, that's a team that really knows what they're doing and is really respecting the source material to the highest degree, because they're respecting the source material to the highest degree isn't just we're trying to replicate it faithfully 100%. It's how do we communicate what is great about this book or whatever it is to an audience as a movie. Like, that's what they're doing here, and that's what you really want in an adaptation.
And that's a consistent, I mean, that's stuff we talked about a lot in the Kimetsu reviews we've done, right?
Yes.
Of how do they take the manga and do that. And, you know, this is, adapting a visual novel is a very different challenge than adapting this is a light novel. Light novel, visual novel, manga, they've done it all.
Yes.
And, you know, the thread between all of that is taking it seriously and thoughtfully and experimentally and adventurously in the same way Nasu's writing is experimental and adventurous. And it's super cool. This movie we could talk about for multiple episodes. It's that kind of rich.
Yes, it's like this movie demands a 5-hour long YouTube video essay. You know, like that's like this is like the one where like you're like, I'm gonna watch like 10 minutes of this and then quit out, and then like half a day later somehow you watch the whole thing. That's like what this movie wants to have.
I think that is a good description. And coming next week from Japanimation Station, not really. That would take a lot of work. Maybe one day.
Yes, that would take like a year to make.
Yes. Anyway, all right. I feel like we're only now getting out of like the preamble of our review, but I feel like we've said a lot of very like in-depth things about it. Maybe just as a little, palate cleanser, just because I want to mention it every week, we do get an intro claymation in this one. This is another don't use your cell phone one, but this one is funny because you have the villain of this episode come in with his blue hair and his magic and turn off the cell phone signal so the cat girl cannot use her cell phone anymore. That made me laugh very hard. It's a very good one.
Yes, it's a tragedy that, that Ufotable hasn't kept doing the claymation thing. It's so fun going back to these and being like, oh, right, they used to do this. I also love the old Ufotable logo that's on these movies as well. Like, I kind of had missed that, like, weird logo also.
Yeah, it's good. I just love the idea of taking the villain from this movie and have him in the playful fucking claymation sketch, given the truly abhorrent and disturbing things he does throughout the runtime of this movie. It's great.
Yes, yeah, 100%.
So anyway, love that. I am 100% planning on cutting out all of these claymation skits and then some other stuff I'm going to find and using these to intro movies in my screenings for my film theory class next semester, which is ongoing as these are airing. So you can hold me to that. I hope that's happening because I think that will be fun and confuse all my students.
Yes, but then, like, hopefully you have, like, the one student that has, like, seen these movies before. He's like, I know where this is from.
Yes.
Like, I know this teacher is a massive fucking nerd.
And I go, you win! You get the chocolate factory! You're teaching the class now! All right. Where do you want to go next talking about Paradox Spiral?
Oh, Jesus. I guess, so the movie is split into 3 sections, right?
Yes.
And it, like, literally where they're like...
They repeat this title screen.
Yes. It almost feels like an Eyecatch in a weird way. Like, obviously, these are, this is a movie. This is the most movie feeling of all of these. Like, there's something weird about this where even though they are all movies, they all aired in movie theater, this is the one that feels like it's like, oh, this is Kata no Kyoukai, the movie, is almost how I feel like you could refer to it. Because I think they knew... Obviously, this is the one that's 500 fucking pages. It's almost twice as long as the next longest section of the book. They knew this is the fan favorite one. They knew this is like the most popular part of the novels. This is the biggest. It's the most fleshed out. It feels like this is like they're putting their full weight behind it. And there's something here where, they're building that in immediately. There's like this little prologue that you get flashes of all this crazy shit happening that's mostly centered around the end of the first section where Shiki gets captured, Injo sees Soda and gets stabbed, and there's the crazy eyeball shot that I love where his eye like goes all the way around the socket to the other end, which is very creepy. And then you get your opening titles, and then it gets you into this sort of Injo Tomoe section where you get it's like 40-something minutes of the movie that is all from his general POV. You get he's like effectively a new protagonist character you get only for this film. And that 40 minutes or so at the beginning is all to like establish him and to start set up this kind of crazy mystery we're in. And I think immediately it is incredibly striking because he has his, the thing that happens with his family that we later learn is this whole crazy thing in the mansion. But you get this movie started off with a very horror vibe of him stabbing his mother to death, ripping out like the guts or whatever, and like holding onto the guts and going kind of insane and running out of his house. And then one of my favorite shots that they have, lots of these shots of you looking from the outside in at the apartment, like where the doors are. They do this both for the mansion complex, and then they also do this for Shiki's mansion that she lives in. Again, I'm using the Japanese word mansion here. And it's just this like static horizontal shot looking at those doors and seeing the guy trying all the doors, the homeless guy who's going to come in, and he goes across the whole frame slowly, bit by bit, until he gets to that last door that is open, comes in, and then that's when the camera comes in with him, and he sees the horror of everything that happens. Like, what a great, like, shocking, startling kind of like, again, horror movie setup to this whole thing.
It is deeply, deeply distressing. That is very true. Yeah, I think Tomoe is such an interesting character immediately because it's so unclear, and the movie's editing structure keeps you so on your toes of like, okay, he is experiencing two realities, one of which he is sure is real and one of which he thinks is a dream, but it is unclear to the viewer how much he is correct in that, right? Like, he is an unreliable narrator of his own life in that sense, right? And so we have two, and it's not just two versions, they are two mutually exclusive versions, right?
Yes.
Because he is dead in one and he is the killer in the other. And they are both extremely disturbing, one of which, as you say, ripping the guts out. It's literally, he has like her large intestine in his hands and he's like holding it to his face and it's like glowing and it's fucked up. It's very fucked up. And, you know, then we come out into that and you have previews of the stuff that's going to happen with, what's the villain's name? Sorry, Senjo? Soren. You have like the scenes with him from, we find out like way later in the movie that are kind of like cut together here. And so time is all over the place. It's kind of funny. This movie is so big, and it is, when you talk about this one feeling like a movie, part of it is just the sheer length. This is literally twice as long as the other ones. Part of it is just the scope, because it's not just twice as long. I feel like 3 times as much happens in it. You know, it's like really complicated. But so like now I'm in my mind, I don't even quite remember how he and Shiki meet. It's almost like that's just something that sort of like we almost gloss over, but they are in each other's orbit at a certain point, you know?
Yes. Well, so one thing this movie does is for this first 40-minute section, really large stretches of the movie are both storyboarded and animated by an animator named Tetsuya Takeuchi. That he gets like from what I could tell, doing a little bit of like research into it, because it struck me that there are long sequences of the first 40 minutes of this movie that are visually quite distinctive from the rest of the film.
I wrote this down
from the
too,
rest, yeah, not just the rest of this film, but the rest of the other films.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is that this animator, Tetsuya Takeuchi, who is like really kind of like famous in the animation community, he doesn't do a lot of like, he's an animator. He's not like an animation director and stuff like that. He does key animation on a lot of stuff. One thing I noticed when I looked him up on Sakuga Boru, which is a great website if you want to see like clips of animation and get some like sourcing on who did the animation and stuff like that. He does a lot of, if the anime needs a really great, very detailed shot of somebody playing a musical instrument, this dude does a lot of that stuff. Like the ones where like, oh, they're actually animating like the proper fingering on the guitar. They're not faking it. There's like a dozen clips I found on his page on this website of those kind of clips. So he's like a really, really talented, like top tier animator. And they clearly just gave him the authority to storyboard huge sections of the first 40 minutes. One of those scenes being the whole sequence where after Enjo leaves, right, you then get the scene of him running through the streets. He's being chased by his high school friends or whoever. In the book, it's high school friends. There's a lot more like detail about why that scene is happening in the book. This is like one of the few sections I read in kind of detail. But he's running away from them. He gets cornered in this like little like kind of side garage area. He fucking pokes that dude in the eye, which is really violent, and also is a thing, another kind of one of many, many, many sequences that are going to be mirrored, or there's going to be some kind of dual other version of that or a motif, something that you're going to pick up again later. So he stabs the kid in the eye. He then gets the shit kicked out of him, and then Shiki comes into that. And out of like it's all like steamed and fogged up, and she comes in and beats the shit out of those dudes, and helps Enjo out, and basically like through just like her not giving a shit about anything, ends up giving this guy like a place to stay for months at a time. But that whole sequence has really, really detailed, intricate animation. And it's, as far as I can tell, that whole sequence is just animated by Tetsuya Takeuchi and was storyboarded by him as well.
So this was I'm really glad to know that, because I was going to ask you about that. That is one of my first notes in my notes here, just that I wrote the character animation is just like a notch more impactful. It's all the animation in these movies is fluid, but there's like a level of fluidity and detail that feels like the phrase I kind of came up with was, it feels like it's really emphasizing the weight of bodies in motion. So when like he puts the finger in the eye, it's not just an abstract, oh, he poked that dude's eye out. It's like, I can feel that in my gut that he is poking that dude's eye out. And I think like, and then when Shiki comes in, you also notice it because we've seen Shiki fight before, and this looks noticeably different. And I think the way it's very important that I think this is the first real action sequence of the movie, because it gives you kind of a almost thesis statement visually on how it's going to treat violence. The violence in this movie is very visceral and impactful. And not that violence is ever used casually in these movies, but I think there's just an extra level of like kind of feeling it in the gut in this one that sets it apart.
Yes, and Takeuchi also animated the big sequence at the end of the first part, which is her fighting the zombies in the hallway.
That's such
you
a good
talked about
sequence.
earlier. That's him. He storyboarded and animated that whole thing.
That one blows me away because it's kind of not in the Ufotable style as we've come to know it now. It's actually done in a very traditional anime sense of it's a side view mounted camera, or the camera like panning very slowly as Shiki's just fluidly just going through all of these guys. And then it gets more complex as it cuts past that point. But it's like, it's pure like, here, go to town animator, and everything else is kind of static. It's great.
Yeah, and as far as I can tell, that is basically what they did. They're like, hey, man, go to town on this shit. Like, like fucking go for it. Because, again, Takeuchi is, like, very well known for very intricate animation and, like, lots of, like, big battle scenes he's done. He's, like, done fight scenes in Naruto and stuff like that when they need to do a big fight. It's that kind of a ringer that you pull in kind of thing.
Yeah. But this whole section of the movie this is probably the most straightforward, which is a weird way to say it, but when it is Shiki and Enjo together at home, and these seemingly months, maybe like at a certain point it becomes clear it's been a year since the first episode, which chronologically happened right before this. And so a lot of time is passing over this, and we have a really crazy montage. But before we get into the crazy montage, there's just some nice slow scenes of these two characters living in their little mansion apartment together. We should actually probably explain that terminology for anyone who's unfamiliar.
Yeah, I think we mentioned it in the last episode, but mansion is a Japanese term that means, for us, like a condo or apartment complex, generally speaking. And so when they call both the like big tower in this, they refer to as mansion, as well as Shiki's little shitty little tiny apartment she lives in. Both of those would just be referred to as mansions, which has it has a linguistic similarity to our word for mansion, but no definitional similarity to our word for mansion, which means like a giant house for rich people.
Right, exactly. It's a very different idea. In the subtitles I was watching, they did condo, which is probably a decent translation of it. It gets the basic idea across. I think I would argue condo maybe sounds nicer in the English context than like what they're actually describing, because these are like for single people or small families. And in fact, it is important that Enjo's family has fallen from a house to a little mansion apartment. They are on top of each other in that space, and that is, I think, part of the idea, is that they are condo is a normal place for a family to live. This would be a little abnormal, certainly from the social strata they started in, to fall to this place.
Yeah, because there's meant to be something suffocating about these little rooms. In particular, like with Shiki's is interesting, we've commented on before that like her apartment is tiny, but it almost feels big because it's so empty, which I think is like, part of like the point of the effect of that set that we have now seen multiple times, because we've revisited in all the present day Kata no Kyokais. It's one of my favorite locations. There's something like so effective about that little tiny empty room that she lives in. But yeah, I think that there is like like lots of kind of pairings and dualities across this whole movie. That is another one of them, is this empty, a weirdly spacious, small apartment room that Shiki lives in versus the like clustered, claustrophobic, kind of disgusting, like you've got to get out of there apartment that Enjo lived in with his family.
And Shiki, like Enjo doesn't know this, but we know it, has fallen in a sense. Like, Shiki did live in what we would in America call a mansion, right? She lived in this, like, almost like old Japanese, castle kind of setting, right? In episode 2. Mm-hmm. And now she's living in this small space. And of course, it's kind of the reverse, because she is much more free in this small space than she was in that spacious house. And the opposite kind of happened to Enjo. But when he goes to Shiki's place, there is kind of a freedom and acceptance. One of my favorite details here is that Shiki starts buying the strawberry Haagen-Dazs, the single cup Haagen-Dazs, for Enjo, and keeps giving it, and Tomoe keeps eating them, and we see these comically large trash piles of them piling up. That man, he must have a stomach of steel to eat that many single serving Haagen-Dazs strawberry ice creams. But I was thinking about this. This is one of, I think, the best examples of how the sequencing has worked in these movies, because if these had been presented to us in chronological order, then the details about Shiki's relationship to that strawberry ice cream and how Kokuto started doing that for her, that would have just happened in the previous episode. Because chronologically, Overlooking View, the first movie, happened right before this one, and so it would have been something that, we just saw. But instead, the strawberry ice cream thing, especially in how Ufotable has laid it out in their adaptation, is the first thing we ever learned about Shiki, is her as a loner in this apartment, and one of the ways Kokuto is trying to get through to her is giving her these single-serving strawberry Haagen-Dazs. And now she turns that and starts doing that for Enjo. That, to me, is the brilliance of the sequencing of this thing. That is why, chronology and continuity is overrated, because sometimes if you want to relate the actual emotions of a story, you have to do it out of order. And what I feel like in my bones hits me about this movie wouldn't hit me as hard if we had watched this in chronological order for some reason,
Yeah, I 100% agree that we started with this kind of mysterious, weird, broken version of Shiki that is so distant and alien to you in that first movie, and you're trying to kind of get access to her the way that Kokuto is, and then you get all this other story and context for her to the point where we got episode 4. Now we know who she is. We feel like we're on very solid footing with her. There's still mysteries. There's still the whole serial killer thing from episode 2 that's not resolved. But we feel like we know who she is now. And so now it feels appropriate on our journey with the character for her to then start doing for other people what Kokuto has done for her. And yes, I think that's that structure absolutely is much more powerful because it is reflecting how we have experienced her as a character, not necessarily her experience as a character in that world. And our experience is more important because we're the audience. She is a fake person in a movie, So yeah, I think it's a very good example of what this structure is doing and what they're intentionally doing with the structure for the audience.
And one of my favorite things about this movie that we haven't talked about yet is there is a very, what we would call a present absence, in that Kokuto and Shiki are never on screen in this movie until the post-credits scene. And the ending of the movie is the implication, the cut to credits moment is the implication that they're about to finally share space together. Even though narratively there are scenes in this movie where they share space together, they have edited it, and this is one of my favorite tricks the movie plays. It's very obvious in the second act of the movie, the sort of Kokuto-centric act, where there are multiple scenes where Shiki is technically in the scene. We know because people are referring to her. We hear the voice a couple of times. She is there, but she's never on screen. And in fact, in some scenes, like when Kokuto gives her the sword, the deconstructed sword, which we see her building with Tomoe in the first act of the movie, that is shot from her point of view, and it's a first-person shot. But the effect of all of this is that they are separated for all of this movie, and they are not together. And again, this is part of the brilliance of the editing, and that there are truths that you can only get to by breaking chronology and continuity, is that clearly Shiki feels distant from Kokuto in this movie and is realizing that she misses that connection. That's the whole kind of idea that we start to get, especially in the second half of this movie, and that final moment where the post-credit stinger is fully her accepting him into her life by asking for the key in exchange, which, given the weight of keys as a motif in this movie and their connection to the idea of family, is about the most intimate thing she could ask him to do. Honestly, even if there were like a full sexual advance, I don't know if it would feel as intimate based on the motifs of this film. And so having this kind of like blown apart and they do this in the first half too, where there are scenes where we know Koto is there, but we don't see them together. It's brilliant, and it's so clever.
Yes, and there's actually like one trick that they do is that in the sort of climactic sequence of the movie where Shiki has her like moment of enlightenment or whatever that we can talk about, that, when she re-arrives in the elevator with the sword and all that, and you have this big montage where she effectively experiences the whole movie in chronological order, where she has like put it all together. We'll talk about maybe what like all that means. But there is a sequence there. I think it's actually the sword scene where it shows you the sequence you've already seen animated before, which is the shot from her perspective. And then they do a reverse shot. That is a new shot. So they introduce a shot, reverse shot thing that builds a space where even though you don't see them in the same shot, in the room together, literally, you have built a cinematic space where they are both together. And like, that's the first time that happens in the movie. And it's during that kind of epiphany sequence, however you want to describe it. But yes, it is one of my favorite sections of shots in this movie are all of the POV shots that almost have like a Sega CD game effect to it in some places where characters are talking to the camera. Or it reminds me a lot of, if we ever we'll definitely one day do our KyoAni podcast series or season on Kyoto Animation Studios, where they have a show called Hyoukai, where there's a whole secret like storyline that is about like a student film where characters are talking into camera. There's something about those scenes that reminded me of that, of like, there's something fun about anime characters talking into the camera that's so kind of weird because it's a language you don't see often in live action, but you almost never see in anime. And there's something very kind of exotic about that technique being used.
Absolutely. And this is something that's true in Kara no Kyoukai from episode 1 to here, is that when it does first-person shots, it wants you to like keep in mind this is a first-person shot. There's another one that I love when Shiki and Enjo go explore the building, is you have this really striking CGI shot for them walking in first person through the space. It's kind of how we are introduced to how the spatial relations of this very weird building works. And they even do this little thing where they have the camera bouncing along with like their eye line as they're moving through the space, which of course is something you just never see in animation. That's, the camera is generally in animation very stable. And so like it becomes embodied in that moment in a way that like in a live action movie, this would be a handheld shot, Yeah.
And it's one of those fun things of where Ufotable being very adventurous with their sort of like the camera and using the camera as a like physical prop almost, because of their experience with 3D, you get those kinds of shots. Yeah, and that is one of my favorites as well, because it's just like, it's trippy. It's just that thing where, again, you've seen live action stuff do a shot like that all the time. It's super common, particularly in like horror movies and stuff like that. A shot like that is very, very common. But in animation, because it is like you have to put so much effort to do a shot like that in animation, whereas in live action, the reason why lots of horror movies like to do a shot like that is that that's a very easy kind of shot to shoot.
Yes.
Whereas for anime, like you got to put a lot of effort to reproduce that effect. But it is very important to kind of dislodge the viewer from their expectations on the like aesthetic world you exist in, particularly for this movie, because a huge section of the ending of the first part and then the ending of the second part, or like scattered throughout the second part even, and the whole third part take place in this building that is designed to basically drive people crazy, as effectively the paradox spiral of the title of the film. And I think that some of those like weird, disorienting, or like unusual or exotic camera choices are meant to induce that effect, as long with some of the editing choices induce that effect in the audience.
I mean, this is another whole way we could approach, and this could be the way we approach this movie for an entire podcast, is just discussing how they articulate the space of the building, because, you know, animated productions have sets in much the same way live action ones do. It's just they're, you know, they still have to be conceptualized. They just don't have to be built in the real world, right? Not that sets in movies today are always built in the real world. Thank you, Marvel.
Yeah.
Not actually, thank you. But anyway, but this is like one of the best and fullest articulated sets I've ever seen in an animated production. Maybe just the most. I'd have to think on it, but it's incredibly like in-depth how they have created this space. And part of that is that it's not just the space itself, it's that it explodes out into the entire structure of the movie, into visual techniques they use, into the editorial techniques, in that the movie itself becomes the paradox spiral. So you know what it feels like to be in this building because it's the feeling of watching this movie to a certain degree.
Yes, yeah, because, you know, as you get explained to you kind of at the beginning of the end of part one, and then you get trickled through part two, because Toko, we learn, was one of the people who designed the building, because it's her and her group of like mage buddies from the clock tower in London. Or I guess they have not said the clock tower yet. The clock tower is a thing we'll talk about later. But the main, it's like kind of like Hogwarts.
Why should I even watch the rest of these, Sean? You ruined it. Yes. Now I know there's a clock tower involved. I'm done. I'm kidding.
Yeah, imagine what if like Hogwarts was rad as shit. That's what the clock tower in London was. What if like
I did have a little bit of imagining, like, because this is two boys and a girl, and they're all at a magic school, there is a little bit of a Harry, Ron, Hermione thing going on here, and I love the idea of a Harry Potter sequel one day, where I guess it would be Harry rips out Hermione's heart, squeezes it to death, then rips off her head, and then Ron squeezes her eye out and crushes the head. That would be a pretty fucked up Harry Potter sequel, you know? With the way J.K. Rowling is going, who the hell knows? It could happen. But
I like you calling Soren a boy when he's like 100 years old, immortal, like monk priest who like we have seen is like on the battlefield of like fucking Sekigahara or some shit. Like, it's he's like, that's my favorite mental image, is like that dude, you know, because they say at school, quote unquote, and when you get brief flashes of what the clock tower, which is the school that they go to in London that trains mages, one of the schools in this world that trains mages, it makes more sense. This is not Hogwarts. Right. It's not like buddies going to school. You know, you're going to have weird, crazy monk people and shit like that at the clock tower. But it is funny that they sometimes just refer to it as like, oh, back in my school days, when you're a 500-year-old crazy monk dude. But yes.
It's like, you know how there's that super fucking weird, given the source material, Attack on Titan chibi show where they're in high school together? It's like Kara no Kyoukai High School, and it's these three at like a Hogwarts-esque setting, and they're all chibi-fied. That would be really disturbing.
It would be very disturbing. Anyways, the thing we learn is that she helped design the building, right?
Yes.
Before we went on my clock tower diversion. But I like the sort of the weird explanation you start getting of the design of this building, then particularly later when Koto describes it, where he's, I think, even into more detail of it. It's like these two semicircle towers, and obviously this is like meant to reflect the yin-yang symbol that you get at the beginning of the movie or in all the title cards. And that the yin-yang thing has been a motif all the way throughout. But these two semicircles, and that they are separated. You can only cross from one to the other at the lobby. And there is something about that idea alone that is like weirdly really uncomfortable to me. There's something like in my bones, the idea of being in that building and like knowing there's this like mirror other building right there. But if you wanted to go to someone on the other side of it, you have to go all the way down to the lobby, cross around to the lobby and go up. There's something about that, like the boundary that is set up there that is like very discomforting to me. And I don't know what it is, but I think like something about that idea that Nasu hits on, I think like hits something in your gut of like, there's something off about that barrier and like the inaccessibility and having to go to this like nexus at the bottom of the building in order to like physically cross over. So there's just something there that's weird about the design of the whole thing. But then, of course, you get all the stuff of the elevator slowly shifts when it goes up. And so, like, the whole design of the building is meant to disorient you. So you cannot tell which floor you're on. You are going to the wrong rooms because it has moved around. It's like a little bit, I wonder if it was inspired by the H.H. Holmes murder house, effectively, who H.H. Holmes was a serial killer in America in the late 19th century, who he trapped people in his house that he had designed, and designed this house with like weird dead ends and like strange like sort of angled rooms and stuff to disorient people, and then he killed them. And there's something about some of the explanation here that feels a little like that. It's about to like, you're meant to be disoriented, trapped, like guided to like places that where you are not intending to go. And then the whole design of the building is meant to sort of like cage you in. And you know, ultimately Soren is using this to create, as he describes, like a kind of pocket world. Like it's his own little like experiment of humanity closed off from the rest of existence, as he's like repeating the deaths of every single person that lives in this complex, in order for him to try to, I don't know if we want to get into this yet, but him trying to reach the root, I mean, all this crazy shit of like his mage experiments, effectively, and trying to sort of get at the truth of humanity and reality by creating his own world for him to experiment with humanity. And like that whole like exploration you do of that space throughout the whole movie, and those kind of slow reveals of what all this is and how it is trapping and killing these people, is very effective, and it's very disturbing.
It is, and you know, you were comparing it to H.H. Holmes and stuff like that, but I like how the movie really pulls it out just of sort of the daily surreality of living in a high-rise or an apartment building. Like, Toko has this whole monologue, one of her many, you know, insightful philosophical monologues, where when they're in the elevator, she says to Kokuto, she says, you know, high-rises are strange. The higher you go up in the elevator, the harder it is to figure out where you are. If one manipulated the buttons and switched the floor numbers, you wouldn't be able to tell whether you were on the 4th floor or the 5th. The only way to verify where you live is the small directory in small print in the lobby. Units, rooms, and ordinary everyday life can easily become out of the ordinary. And I think that's just a great piece of writing, and it's, you know, what this building really is it's not necessarily in a storytelling sense, it's not supposed to be like an alternative to high-rise living. It is the like nth degree exploded out version of this admittedly weird human phenomenon, right? And you and I have never lived in areas where, like, you know, you would live in like a big high-rise tower or something like that. But, you know, I've certainly been to like hotels or something in a big city where you go up 50 floors, and it's just extraordinarily surreal to get in a box and then get out of the box. And the only reason I know I am this high up in the air is if I go look out a window, but there aren't that many windows, or I just trust that's what the box did, you know? And the idea that the box could not do that, that it could break your trust, is genuinely very scary. And I think that is an idea this movie plays on, because it is such a breach to the body, to the mind, to get off the elevator and not be where you think you are, you know?
Yeah, to have been taken by the elevator where the elevator wants you to go, not where you have wanted to go.
One of the many ways in which, you know, Willy Wonka's Chocolate Factory is a house of horrors, and the man should not be around children.
Well, no, truly, actually, all elevators should be big glass elevators, I think, the things we learned, because then you'd be able to figure it the fuck out.
That's true. Now I want Ufotable's Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory anime. I think it'd be pretty crazy.
Yeah, but there is something, as you say, there's something like kind of dehumanizing or something about the experience, particularly like this weaponized version of this experience, but this experience of being shuffled off into this weird little microcosm of its own, of this big tower, and that you're kind of isolated out from everything, surrounded by people and surrounded by like metal and glass, but somehow you're also like removed completely from the world. And that is what Soren is like literally doing. He is literally removing people from the world in a metaphysical sense, with the way that metaphysics work in the reality of like the Nazi stuff, is like they are cut off from the whole like spiritual concept and the cycles of like reincarnation and the energy and like all the things that exist in our world. They are in their own microcosm, and they need to be for him to perform his experiments. And yeah, there's something about like the combining of the sort of fantasy and horror metaphysics and everything of this movie, and then that is all related very intentionally to this sort of real world thematic experience.
Yeah. Why don't we just go ahead and like get into the plan and break it down so we have it on the table so we can talk about all the different pieces of the movie, because we're already pretty close to broaching all of that, so I think we might as well.
Yes, because this is also where we have to talk about some of the proper nouns here. Garden of Sinners, if you're, I mean, any English language version you're watching this on, is a very old translation for a type moon thing. Because if you're watching it on Crunchyroll, that is just pulling it from the old English language Blu-ray releases. And so we now have much more standardized translations for some of the proper nouns in type moon stuff that are like common across different projects like Fate. This does not use those. I'm trying to scroll through your screenshots, Jonathan, to find some of these, because I know you had a couple. Because one of the main ones is the root, which I think they translate as the vortex of radix.
Yeah, it's the vortex of radix, also known as the Akashic records, which they call the root of all phenomena, and then they go in, it's the truth, all this stuff, yeah.
Yes, so this is a thing, the quote-unquote vortex of radix, what in Japanese is called the kongen or kongen no uzu, which is now typically translated as the root, or if you get the kongen, the uzu part of kongen no uzu would be the swirl of the root. Usually it's just called the root. And I believe that translation is actually a Nasu. I think it comes from him. Like a lot of the English language stuff actually comes from him, because he likes to let me write this thing in kanji and give it kind of a slightly either appropriate or sometimes very nonsensical English language word. Eventually we'll get to talk about noble phantasms, and I'm very excited to have that conversation. But the root, I believe, comes from him. I'm not entirely sure what the radix part of the vortex of radix is, because that is presumably supposed to be the root part of the swirl of the root. But conceptually what it is it's the Akashic record idea, if you're familiar with that. If you've played some of the relatively recent, when this comes out, Genshin Impact material with the Akasha terminal and all of that, it's pulling on similar ideas. It is this idea that there is a metaphysical space, a conceptual space, where all knowledge is quote unquote stored. Not stored, it exists. Stored implies intent. It exists in some sort of metaphysical place deep at the root of reality and of existence. And by all of knowledge, I mean all things that have ever existed, that currently exist, that can and will and should exist in the future. And at the root, time has no meaning. Time is a flat circle or whatever. Everything exists there. All knowledge of all of creation, everything that can, has, and ever will be, is there. The goal of mages in the Nasu-verse, whether you're talking about Kanda no Kyoukai, Tsukihime, Fate, it's all connected. The goal of mages, generally speaking, is to try to reach the root, because by reaching the root, you gain access to that knowledge, and you also then could cast true magic. That's the thing we'll visit later when in Fate, when that becomes more relevant. But effectively, it allows them to sort of alter reality, rather than just casting magic that is I can shoot some fireballs or do some I can jump really high. I can do cool stuff. It's I can now alter the fundamental nature of what the world is because I have access to the root. And that is
so it's like Gandalf magic instead of Harry Potter magic.
Yes. Yeah. It's more, it's more conceptual if you're able to actually reach the root. And as Toko says in this movie, Alba argues that nobody has ever reached the root. Nobody knows if the root actually exists. Toko says the root does exist. We know it must exist because, if we wouldn't have the idea of it if someone hadn't reached it, because it is a conceptual place, but anyone who reaches the root presumably has died and can never come back. But that is the goal of mages. So again, it is a thing that will come up multiple times in Fate. And when it does, it will not be called the vortex of radix. I have no idea where the fuck that translation comes from. It will be called the root. Or the swirl of the root, if they want to give the full translation. And again, Akashic Records is just that idea. So Akashic Records is, if you know what that is from actual history or theosophy, where that idea comes from, it is that concept.
The vortex of radix very much sounds like something you would get in Neon Genesis Evangelion.
Yes.
Not quite something you would get here. Not that, there is overlap, obviously. We know Nasu was inspired by Eva, but it sounds like the kind of bullshit you would get in Eva that I love and hate at the same time.
Yeah, I like the term the root because it's it's very clear. And it's a very direct translation of kongen, the Japanese word that's used, which literally is the word for root in the kanji for origin. So it's that idea. It's the root of all things. The other big proper noun we need to talk about that I actually did not remember was in this movie, but is going to be a thing that will come up later in Fate, is what is generally called the counterforce. They call it here, I think they call it the deterrence force, I want to say was the translation they used, which is a very boring name for the counterforce. The counterforce is, like, this is the thing that, like, one of the reasons why Soren has to create this whole experiment is he needs to create his own microcosm of a world in order to cut itself off from the rest of existence, in order to hide it from the counterforce. The counterforce is basically conceptually like a force that exists in the world, like an energy that's generated by like the collective subconscious, which is an idea that comes up at the end of this movie as well. That is a basically an energy that tries to push back against any threat against like reality. Like, so any sort of like extinction level threat of humanity, or anything that would like alter reality in some way that could potentially be irreparable, the counterforce tries to move against that. You can almost think of like the force in Star Wars. It's a thing that's trying to create some level of stability, and any timeline or anything that goes too far off into kind of dangerous territory, the counterforce will, usually through like mysterious means, try to move against it. It'll like kind of act through characters, produce events, or then eventually we'll get like there are agents of the counterforce, and that is like a concept we'll eventually talk about. But here, I think arguably Shiki is like the counterforce is operating through Shiki, I think is one like interpretation of the movie. And a thing that I think Toko kind of offers up, and like that the barrier, the kind of microcosm that Shoten has constructed starts to fall apart because Enjo is able to escape and like open it up to the influence of the rest of the world. He's kind of able to reconnect to his humanity, and thus symbolically like reconnect to the public, like the universal subconscious of humanity, or the collective unconscious, and thus like give the counterforce access to what is happening here. And Shiki is kind of, arguably that is why she is as powerful as she is at the end of the movie. If you want to get very literal about it, is like the counterforce is moving through her. Not to say that she doesn't have her own will. Again, it's more of like a force in Star Wars kind of mystical concept. But that's part of what is happening here in the kind of the metaphysics. So you're brushing up against these like spiritual, philosophical concepts of these kinds of energies or ideas or forces that exist fundamental to the nature of reality in this universe, that because of how far Soden is going, he's trying to access some fundamental nature of reality and alter it so that he can record the deaths of all of humanity, of any human that has ever lived or will ever live. He wants to basically end humanity and record their deaths because he thinks that will give everybody meaning. That if their deaths are marked down in some conceptual history, everybody's death will be as meaningful as everybody else's death. And for him, that would like prevent the tragedy that he has seen repeated throughout history, that all these people die and nobody ever remembers like 99% of everybody who has ever died. And that is kind of his desire. And the counterforce would move against a desire like that and accessing the root, because it is against the will of the collective subconscious. So that's like the kind of the big weird Nasu kind of stuff that is happening if you want to get to that level.
Well, no, that's good, and I'm glad to hear that explanation, because even with the best subtitles on Earth, I wouldn't have known about it in that depth, because I haven't read and seen all this other stuff. But I will say, I think the subtitles are totally fine. This is like the official like Aniplex, subtitles that are on their releases and on Crunchyroll. But I definitely, the use of the term deterring force, or again, whatever, I'm forgetting what it was exactly too. I think the way they presented it, and I couldn't quite tell what it was in Japanese, because some of this is crazy Japanese above my level, is like, it almost sounded like I was, because there's also the barrier that, Soren is making, and I'm like, did he make both barriers? It's a little confusing, especially if the terminology is not super, like, clear about it. Counterforce does seem like a much clearer concept.
Yes, because it's meant to counter something. It's not meant to deter something. Like, I think deterrence force, which I'm pretty sure is what they call it, is like a bad translation. That's not, I mean, again, I don't think it would be particularly clear anyways. It's not like the movie stops to explain it. I glanced at some of these sections in the book, and the book is a lot more clear on it, because it's able to stop and kind of explain those concepts more clearly, because you get like more kind of access to Toko talking about it, whereas that would slow the movie down to a snail's pace, and you wouldn't ever want to do that for a movie. But I do think the terminology I wish that they were a little bit sort of like cleaner on, because I think those official translations we've now settled on, which is what they will talk about in Fate, or if you play Fate Grand Order, all these things pop up in that game. I think those are better terms. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense, and that's cool. And I'm forgetting the exact, like, where Tsukihime and Fate kind of all fit into this. Is Kara no Kyoukai the first, like, published thing where he's articulating some of these ideas?
The first published thing, yes. A lot of these ideas are developed in Mahotsukai no Yoru, the thing that now the remake of the visual novel is going to come out, or will be out by the time that these podcasts come out. That is the first thing he writes, that original novel version, but that is never published. And that actually, there's a reference to that in this movie, because the main character of Mahotsukai no Yoru is Aoko Aozaki, which is Toko's younger sister. So some of the little hints you get of Toko's background, those are actually ideas he pulled from Mahotsukai no Yoru, because she's a character in that as well.
Making me even more excited to read that visual novel that I will probably have already read by the time this is out. But yes, very, very cool. Also, another compelling reason for Ufotable to be doing the movie of that, which they are. So, very good.
Yeah, so that's the big crazy like universe metaphysics stuff. Where do you want to go from now, Jonathan?
Well, because what that results in is, Enjo there are a lot of characters suffering in this apartment complex, but Enjo is, of course, our point of view character in this, and he is the one who, as you say, escapes because it kind of escapes because of Soren's arrogance. Soren could have stopped him, but considers it, it won't influence things because this, what he considers a mindless doll sort of got out of the simulation, right?
He calls him, he says his origin is worthlessness. If you wanted to get into the even more metaphysics stuff, there's the concept that everybody is born with a origin, or kigen is the Japanese word, that is a kind of almost elemental idea in some ways, that it's a fundamental part of your core spiritual identity. Deep down you're ingrained, it is ingrained in who you are, that's retained through the cycle of reincarnation and stuff like that. And that Soren claims that Shiki's origin is nothingness, is the kata of kata no Kyoukai, and then he says that Enjo's is worthlessness. And so he sees him as someone who has literally no value, because from his perspective, that's not only is he useless, from Soren's point of view, he is the concept of uselessness effectively itself. It is engraved in the nature of Enjo's very being, is that he's kind of pointless. He will always be someone who accomplishes nothing, whose life will end meaninglessly. For Soren, the majority of humanity leads and ends meaningless lives that will be forgotten, and Enjo's just another one of those. And for Soren's perspective, Soren accomplishing his goal will give Enjo's life some amount of meaning, because he will be equivalent to everybody else in this historical record, this kind of conceptual record that Soren wants to make of all of humanity, and sort of level that all out.
Yeah. And, as much as is going on in this movie, and it's a lot, there is a very clear central arc with Enjo, because it is ultimately a journey of him from the feeling of, even if he doesn't know all of what Soren is saying, he does, at the beginning of this movie, think his life is worthless because he killed his parents, or he thinks he killed his parents, and he believes he should just die, basically, and he has no worth. It just so happens that the person he runs into is probably the one person on Earth he could run into who would accept him, because it's the one person who wouldn't run screaming when he says, "I just murdered people and I inhaled their guts." And Shiki is like, "Oh, cool, come to my place," right? Because not exactly like that. But it is sort of, Shiki is the one person who is not going to, look at this murderer and go, "Oh, well, you're awful, I'm going to call the cops," or something, right? Shiki is like, "This is interesting, let's talk," because Shiki, one, as we come to learn, is dealing with a sort of loneliness from not having Koto around as much. And then there is, these other just perpetual effects that she's having about, her own existence. And when they come together, you do have its nothingness and worthlessness, sort of bouncing off each other and discovering that there's actually a lot there. And of course, Enjo's journey over the course of this movie is discovering how much he does care about the world and waking up to that and ultimately deciding I just find a tremendously moving scene when he and Kokuto are at the apartment deciding on what to do, and he decides, I'm going to go to that building. I am probably going to die, but I promised Shiki I was going to die, but I'm going to die for myself. I'm going to go here for my parents, for myself, to make sure this, meant something. And I think that's incredible. And even though Enjo dies 20 minutes before the movie ends, like technically is when his body is destroyed, his spirit so clearly survives through everything everyone is talking about, through what Shiki does, through the insistence characters make of it's the wound he gives to Soren that like makes this all possible. And so he is really the main character of the movie.
Yeah. And it's like Toko gives you her part of her speech at the end to Soren is like, hey, like it's all of this fell apart because this one little boy who like represents or is like family love, had this love for his family, escaped your little experiment, and that created like the one hole that needed to happen. And it's like, and that's all of this happened because of him, because you let him get away, and then of course you get the ending scene of him kind of effectively moving off into the afterlife at the very, very ending. So yes, like his spirit definitely like sort of permeates through to the full end of the movie. And I mean, he's clearly like the primary protagonist of this film, even though he's absent for a big stretch of the second part of the movie when you're primarily with Kokuto, because Enjo is the first character you met in the movie. He is the one who you were with for the whole intro. While you're with Kokuto, you're kind of waiting constantly for Kokuto and Enjo to intersect. The beginning of part 2 is Kokuto going to Shiki's room after you saw Enjo run there, after he left the apartment. He runs into the room, Shiki's room. Kokuto walks up. This is another one of those shots where you do not realize that you're cutting to a different time period at some point, because when Kokuto tries the door, you get a shot interiorly of Enjo's like eye at the eye hole, and then you cut to Kokuto is not able to open the door because it's locked. He's like, huh. Shiki never locks her door, and you realize later you come to understand that is like a different time he has tried to open Shiki's door after she has started locking it. So even that intro to part 2, you are like building to this moment where you're going to see Mikia and Enjo intersect, and then it is kind of pulled out from under you as you then go on that journey with Kokuto to reach that point at the end of that section.
Yeah. And he's just a tremendously compelling character because it's mixing so many different character types and archetypes. I don't know even how to describe it, but you have, the person with this guilt, over the murderer who is full of guilt, but also because it's not clear what reality is, you also have someone who's almost an amnesiac in a sense. I mean, literally, because also there are parts of his past he is missing that he accesses again in that really standout sequence near the end. You have kind of a like robot learning to love narrative. that's I'm simplifying it, but you have a character who we are very clear in the end is a doll, is something created claiming their humanity, and it's doing all of these things that I think I can draw parallels to in other stories, but collapsing them all into the same character and having all these things going on at once is so interesting. And for me, the moment that crystallizes Enjo as a character is the absolutely striking shot of him when he gets into the warehouse at the bottom of the apartment complex, and it is the room full of all the brains in jars, which just an iconic image, unbelievable. Feels like something out of Akira or something. It's crazy. And he has all these brains in jars, and he goes and finds the one that is his, that is, Tomoe Enjo's. And you have a shot from the point of view of the brain in the jar. So there is like glass and water distorting the image as we're looking at the doll Enjo's face and the horror of this moment of the brain, symbolically the soul disconnected from this body. The body is somewhere else gone. And when we find out, it's fucking dead and decaying in the room. It's horrifying. But it is also this moment of him claiming his humanity, because once he figures that out and realizes it, he becomes very resolute in that he's going to fucking die for something, and in dying for something actually live in a way that, Soren thought was impossible in this body. And that is just, that image so crystallizes that in a way that me putting it into words feels like completely unnecessary. It's just the image does that for you.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of like the poetry of the movie, right? That you've been on such a journey with the character, because also, that whole first part is that first 40 minutes of the movie is primarily like these series of montages of him living out this weird sheltered life in Shiki's apartment and slowly like kind of going out into the world. Eventually, you know, he sees his mom, or like the automaton that is his mom, like walking out there and stuff, and he kind of brings that back to Shiki. But there's a big stretch of the movie where you're just with him stewing in this uncertainty of what has happened. Like, did he kill his parents? Did he not kill his parents? All of that, because, you know, obviously also one of the things at the beginning of the movie is that the police go to investigate and they knock on the door and the dad answers the call, right? And that's like the thing that sets us like, are they dead or are they not? What is actually going on here? And so you spend so much time with the character there, then you get this long period of absence from the character when you're with Kokoto, and then you get to come back with the two of them. And then you get to learn about his history with his family, right? And that's where one of the main motifs of this movie come up. And we hit on it, like, or it was mentioned earlier with the Toko speech in the elevator. But a primary motif of this movie is the concept of Nichijo, or everyday life. Of that, I think there's like a lot here of this idea. I think that the movie really values not the like big noble lives or whatever. It's about that, like, the regular life that you have, the everyday, the moment to moment, the interchangeable things you do every single day, the eating of your ice cream, taking a bath, doing your laundry, going to the bathroom, like the things that like all of us do all the time that makes up 95% or whatever of our fucking lives, is like sleeping, eating, doing chores. Like that's what our lives are. And that there's like a peace and quiet and normalcy to that regular everyday life. Again, it's using the word Nichijo in Japanese, which is literally the word like the kanji for day and the kanji for regular. So like everyday life is how you usually translate that term. But it's just like, it's your routine is another way to think about it. And that is something that like has been taken from Enjo, right? Shiki says to him that like what you should have been doing is trying to protect your everyday life, trying to like protect what your like regular life was. And that's what his home was, right? Because it's also connected to this idea of like, where did you live? Like, what was your home? Not this like weird spiral paradox apartment, but what you feel was your home. And then that all connects to Kokoto taking him there. And you get this beautiful flashback of him as a kid with his father, who at this point we only really know as like this alcoholic, abusive father. But when, there was a period when Enjo was a little kid, clearly his dad still had issues. We find out that like he was an alcoholic his whole life, because we know he lost his license because he had a DUI. Eventually he gets into an accident. He was driving without a license. He was probably drunk, got a person killed. And that created this like spiral from which he couldn't recover. But there was this period where Enjo saw a positive side of his father, and his father gives him that speech about the key. It's like, this key is a thing that protects us, right? It's a thing that like creates the boundary, that it separates the like inside life, the interior life, the family from the outside world. And it's like, this key is the thing that like binds us together and keeps us safe. And I think there's such a powerful message there that connects to this day of everyday life, and connects to the recurring imagery in the movie of unlocking of doors, or trying to get into a door and the door is locked and you can't get access to it. That these keys and these locks are things that allow us to build these boundaries that define what is our regular, what is our everyday life, and what is not. And that is all stuff that Tomoe has been robbed of in this weird apartment with this abusive relationship he now has with his parents. And then this like controlling presence of Soden that has manipulated everything and twisted it and exaggerated everything to the point where now they're dead, and their everyday life is repeating their last day, is repeating their death over and over and over again. And every positive thing they had has been taken from them at this point. I think that there's something so powerful about that slow buildup of ideas, that slow buildup of motifs, to you then learning this little beautiful scene with the key and the dad in the past, and seeing that like, this is the thing of that when Shiki said what you needed to try to do was protect your everyday life, is like, you need to try to like find some way to either win that past back or find a new home that will give you a new regular life that you can have. But like, that's what you need to do. Living this kind of like dead zombie existence is not going to help you.
And that's, this idea is conferred to us also in that one of the first big montages in the movie about sort of the passage of time of Enjo at Shiki's apartment. And one of the obviously the main visual motif of that is both characters unlocking the door and coming in or out. And the end of that montage is a flash of going from Enjo doing it to Shiki doing it back and forth, like at such a speed that it is almost seizure-inducing, right? They do it like dozens and dozens of times, and it is that idea of like that is the core of, because that's the beginning and ending of a day symbolically, right? Of the leaving home, coming home, locking the boundary, reopening the boundary, and going back over it. And they do sort of create this thing for each other that does have meaning, which is part of why Enjo fights for it in the end. And that everyday life, that Nichijou is the thing Soren not only couldn't find meaning in, had such disdain for, that he twists it and curdles it into this thing that makes people in this building go crazy and kill each other. Again, it's like, this is a horror movie, and it's a horror movie in that sense of like, that is one of the most profound violations I can imagine. It's a horror movie in the same way as like I think Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me is, of like something in what should be your normal good daily life curdling into something so abhorrent that is kind of the deepest kind of horror you can imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's just like so much built into this movie of that relationship of the daily life, because I think you get it in that part one with the montage. I think part two also communicates it through part of that, like with a rhyming scene concept, I think communicates that as well. There's like part of your like everyday regular routine of your life is there's an interchangeability of individual moments. And so I think like collapsing those moments into like these kind of super moments of time that is moving fluidly between one or another, I think also gets like some of that feeling across as well in a way I think is very interesting, that like you can kind of conflate every time you go to this apartment together, you can conflate every time you're having a conversation in the office together, that these are every time you go to your friend's house, in this case Kokto, is like it's unsuccessful, but he's trying it multiple times, and it's part of like the regular routine of this couple of months of time that pass in the Kokto side of the story, and you're kind of experiencing that in this weird collapsed way. I think is very compelling. And then the other thing is like to get back onto the Soren point of how he connects to this, because I was scrolling through because I thought you had this line in your screenshots. I think one really important line at the end of the movie, he has this whole speech before he dies, but I think the most important line in that speech is him saying, I'm no one, I just want a conclusion. Because I think all that Soren is he just wants an end. Like he doesn't think about or care about or is not interested in like the means or anything in between where he is and the end that he desires. He just wants that conclusion, that end, which is death. Everything is dead, but like I can be comfortable knowing that like all those deaths are known and they're all equal, and it's like everything is over. And that's all he wants is that end, because he only sees value in that. He doesn't see the value in the things that he understands as being meaningless. All these people, these deaths that he finds being meaningless, which is all these like the normal people that are killed, the random soldier on this like Japanese battlefield that they cut to that shot multiple times of him caressing the dead soldier's face. And like clearly he is like, it has traumatized him in some way that all these people that die what he considers worthless deaths, but he doesn't think about the meaning that their lives had while they lived it for them. All those people had their Nichijou, their regular life, their daily routine. They all had those moments stacked upon moments that gave meaning to their lives. And that's like his mistake, is that he can't see that. And Toko, who is, his sort of counter, she does understand that, because when we see the first Toko die, the thing she says to him is that she found meaning she uses the word Nichijou there, like in her daily life, built up of like all these like small miracles, I think is how she describes it. And that was the thing that she had come to find meaning in, even though she was from the same world as these other two people. She comes from the world of magic. She comes from all the things that being from the world of magic means in this universe, which is this obsession with power and knowledge and this like need, this ambition that drives them, right? That causes these mages in the Nasu stuff, mages almost universally are like fucking monsters, basically. Like a good mage is a very hard thing to come across because they're driven by this need for knowledge and power. And she has kind of let go of all of that because she has found this kind of beautiful everyday life with Kokuto and with Shiki. And that's what she's fighting for and willing to die to try to get back. I think like all of that, again, that motif that you see, it permeates the whole film. It's so powerful. I think one of the most amazing things about the movie is that is just one of the motifs, because all of these like other scenes are usually also touching on multiple other motifs as well. But this was like one of the ones that I think hit me really hard.
Oh, absolutely. And it's another way where I think the movie's editorial structure is doing so much to make you feel this, because I could very easily imagine, and I don't think this would be a stretch at all, the 13-episode single-core anime adaptation of this story. And I don't mean all of Kara no Kyoukai, I mean this one chapter, right? You could do easily. I think that would be pretty, it wouldn't feel like you were stretching it out at a certain point, right? And I think in the 13-episode version, the big flashback that Enjo has at his house where he sees his real memories of the father and all of that, that could be a 22-minute episode. And I don't think it would feel like you would be stretching it. But I think condensing it into, like, that's a quick scene. It's not like a big 10-minute stretch of film. It's like 5 minutes max. It really, they pile on this story of a lifetime right in there through these, repetitive images and fast cuts and breaking of chronology. And we've done it all over the movie and how we're breaking time and showing how, moments blend together, because if you take two moments out of chronology that are similar, they feel like continuity editing, but they aren't. And that gives you this, like, in your gut, sense of this visceral sense of the way time collapses on itself, but in a meaningful way, in that we are kind of living in this kind of spiral just in a daily life, in that, if you were asked to recount your week day by day from, last week, it would be very hard to go hour by hour, day by day and say what you did, but you would remember the themes, you would remember the, 3 classes I taught this week about this book and the way the students reacted, but I wouldn't remember it in this order. I would remember how they all kind of came together in this way, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think the movie is simulating for you sort of the human experience of these ideas, of the everyday life. As confusing as the movie is in its structure, it's also giving you that in a way that you wouldn't get if it were more, straightforward and slower paced.
Yeah, and I think one thing to illustrate that point that's very fascinating that I can, comment on because I watched this movie years and years ago originally, is that the experience of watching this movie does that exact thing. That I think it is possible in your brain to actually kind of for a longer period of time retain the phenomena of the structure of this movie. It inevitably it collapses into a thing that is more logical, because in my memory, all I remembered about this movie was I remembered the plot. I remembered some of the really big key action scenes. I very distinctly remembered the ending, because the ending has always stuck with me with this movie. And I remembered that it had the 3-part structure, that you started with Shiki and Tomoe, that the middle part was with Kokuto, and then all comes it kind of combines together at the end. But I couldn't have articulated anything about the complexities of the editorial structure of this movie at all after that long of a period of time, because even though I could have talked at length in my memory of the themes and some of the ideas and the plotline of this movie, I could have probably described in some amount of detail to you, I would not have been able to replicate anything or commented anything specific about this structure, because I think it's impossible for the brain to remember things that way. It's going to create a more logical or coherent thing out of what has been presented to you. I think that there's something very cool about how that works.
It's almost like compressed data in a computer that, you take all these, I'm not a computer programmer, but I know the basics of, compressing bits and then uncompressing them to be something that is visible to the user, which is also how our brain, to the best of our knowledge, stores memories and stuff, right? Is it kind of blows it apart and puts it in different places, and then we recollect it in out of order. And the movie, it's... To be able to access that and think about that is an incredible feat of artistic effort.
Yeah, and the way that it replicates all these phenomena that the movie is trying to comment on with its story, and then its structure is able to replicate those ideas. It's particularly, it is this notion that you are experiencing the paradox spiral, right? They are throwing you in the midst of it with the way that the movie is built, rather than you trying to admire it from a distance, which I think is how like we would conventionally try to do this sort of story, is you place the viewer at a distance from the disorientation or confusion. Maybe you have like a cold open or something on like an X-Files episode if you had a similar premise that gives you that effect, and it's very weird and kind of nutty. But then ultimately you're really kind of watching most of the story from a remove, admiring the full thing, admiring the, like, to use some of their terminology, like the taiji or the supreme ultimate, you know, the combination of the yin and the yang, and you're admiring the whole, the single, the one piece, rather than being in the midst of it, in the chaos of it, not being able to see the full thing. You're in the midst of these kind of battling forces of the yin and the yang and all of that. That's a much more interesting experience, I think, for his story, is try to put the viewer in there rather than put them in the audience seat.
Exactly, yeah. Can we talk about Toko in this movie?
Yes.
Because she goes through some shit. I'm tempted to just jump straight to the most graphically violent stuff in this series of movies so far, which is her multiple deaths. But, you know, there's so many things going on with her in this film. This is technically the most we've had of all these characters because it's the longest movie. But I feel like, you know, not only do we have a lot of her in this movie, but we get some of her backstory. We're learning about these other, you know, mages that she has a relationship with. We see, as you said earlier, that most of the mages in this universe are pretty shitty people. She is a pretty good person, and we see how different she is from them. Like, her whole kind of almost... I struggle to say it's a lackadaisical worldview because she's so analytical of everything, but she's a very go with the flow kind of person in what we've seen so far, which is very different from the I'm going to end the world to make sense of it, which is what Soren is. So there is this like there's this like higher level battle of the like leading mage characters that are, you know, fundamentally different worldviews. It's like a Professor X Magneto or a fucking, you know, I want to not use a Harry Potter reference, but, you know, for all the people out there, Dumbledore, Voldemort, something like that, you know.
I think the big thing with Toko is that she's let go of her like ambition. Like that's one of the big things about these mages, is that they are driven by this like inhuman, extreme ambition that like goes, again, this is all stuff you'll get in Fate, but like it's typically mages are part of like these big families or clans that go back like generations, and it's passed down from one to the other. And it's like this big thing of like this need, this drive, that pushes you forward to try to go to the root and like find the truth of reality and like make your mark on the world. And like, you know, basically Shiki's family is a part of that whole structure. I don't think they're technically mages, but they're part of that world, right? Because she has inherited her mystic eyes of death perception, like part of the whole, the weirdness you saw in some of like her manner and stuff, in the attitude of her family, her like father, the fucking fighting with real swords and shit in the dojo that you saw in movie 2. That's like that kind of attitude that a lot of the mages have in this universe. I think the thing that makes Toko compelling is that like she has let go of all of that. She doesn't care. She doesn't want that ambition. As she says, she just wants to like live this daily normal life that made up of all these miracles, of all these individual moments, and that's all she needs. And she cares about these kids. You know, we're going to get more of Azaka in the Kokuto's little sister in the next movie is like a big thing for her. You get a little bit of her in this movie, and it becomes like more confirms that she is Toko's apprentice. And so she's passing on some of this like magic to someone who's just like a normal person, not like a destined heir or some shit like that. She's just living like a normal everyday life, letting go of all of those things. And when you get the Alba, and particularly Soren, re-entering things, you see that the kind of twisted, ambitious world that they come from, and how like kind of how fucked up they are, right? Like how far it has twisted them. Alba has this whole speech about how he's like, you know, his whole thing is he's jealous of Toko because she always outperformed him. And then she just let all that shit go. You know, it's like the student that got straight A's when you were like trying your hardest and you could never do better than them. And then they graduated and they like went and ran their like family bakery and lived a happy life, but didn't go become like the CEO of like a Fortune 500 company like you thought they were going to do. It's like that kind of thing. And he's just like, how could you let all this go? Like, you always beat me. And he just walked away from this life. And I think that's like, there's something so suggestive about that, right? Like there's no story as far as I know that goes into more detail of any of those specific characters. Obviously Toko pops up in other stuff, but Alba and Soren, this is, as far as I know, the only thing either of those characters ever appear in. I don't think there's a story that actually tells their like life, their school life at the clock tower or anything like that. But it paints such a picture in this movie. It's so evocative of what their life must have been like and what their relationships must have been like. Again, by when this originally came out, all the stuff about Toko's little sister, that wasn't in a thing that you could get yet. It would be like 10 years after this before Mahotsukai no Yori, the visual novel, actually came out with Aoko. So like this whole backstory that Dasu developed in this unreleased novel that he sort of like, some elements he trinkles in here, and he gives this whole kind of vision of a bigger world out there that he has yet to have depicted any part of in any other story at this point. I think it's just like, it's very fun because it gives you this like taste of this magical world that you don't really get full access to yet.
One of the things I love about Toko and Soren here is this is a whole other thread we could spend hours talking about, is there's a lot of like references to various, sort of faith systems, particularly Buddhism is explicitly brought up here in a couple of places. The whole idea of that Soren has Buddha's ashes embedded in his left hand, which blocks the eyes of death perception, which I love as a like explanation, is crazy. And it comes back when they sort of, Toko and Soren have like their final conversations at the end, is there's some stuff about Buddhism. But Toko is like much closer to the ideal of like a bodhisattva than Soren is, right? Because she's actually let go of worldly attachment to some degree. Like she's let go of those ambitions, and she's the happiest character. She's the most put together character in this series. We keep coming back to her. She's like the safe space we keep going back to, and it's like this movie is where you finally pinpoint why, and it's because she's doing good works in the world. She's going out and either saving lives or at least bringing some peace to the deceased or something, right? But she is not having an ambition of anything beyond that, right? And it's such an interesting perspective.
Yeah, and then you just get this whole very dramatic sequence in the movie, right, where Toko is brutally murdered, just like the most brutal murder you have ever seen. It's it's a thing that like only anime would ever be able to do this. Soren punches through her, and like basically he does a fucking Mortal Kombat fatality, but even worse. Like he like literally like punches through her like chest with her heart from behind, holds it there. They have like a brief conversation, a conversation longer than you would be able to have with anybody if you were literally holding their fucking heart in your hand. Toko really like hangs in there for a while. He crushes her heart, then rips her head off, which I think like that communicates so much about Toko that like I need to be extra fucking sure. Like, it's not enough for me to have ripped your heart out of your chest and just physically destroyed your heart. I also have to take your fucking head off just to make sure you're not going to be a problem, right? And I think more than anything, that speaks volumes of who Toko is and how much of a threat he considers her to be. And then puts her head in a jar. And there's like a good solid like 15-something minute stretch of this movie where, as far as you know, Toko's fucking dead, right? And Miki is like on his way to the like whole mansion complex or whatever while this is happening.
Yeah, I haven't seen the rest of this series, Sean. I haven't seen the other Fate Stay Night stuff. As far as I know, this is the end of the road for Toko. Like, and they kind of sold me on it because I couldn't really see the out from heart ripped out of chest, squeezed to death, head, put in a jar, and then you didn't even mention the scene where Alba takes the fucking head out, pokes out the eye to make it look like it's crying, and then crushes the whole head into fucking dust. I mean, it is so brutal. And again, to my knowledge, I'm like, there are only 2 episodes left in this thing. There's, 1 to 2 more movies. And I know that, like, the movies they made afterwards are set earlier, so maybe this is it for Toko. I was very ready to be like, I guess they killed her. They did not kill her. They kind of killed her. It's just that there were 2 of her.
Yes. I mean, the main hint the movie gives you that Toko's not dead is that because you have, your dual scenes. So you have 2 scenes that take place in the lobby with Alba against the like fresco or whatever. The one later is where he has brutalized Mikia and like smashed his head against that.
I was also
like,
worried about Kokuto. I was like, is he gonna die?
Yeah. It's like, luckily he's got a very thick skull from having to like deal with Shiki's bullshit all the time. So he's like developed that like thick fucking head. So it's like, it saved his life for sure. But, so you have this thing of where Kokuto is like collapsed on the ground with blood splurted on the wall. And there is a shot the first time Toko enters, as far as the first time Toko enters that room with Alba standing behind the fresco, Mikia is on the ground with the blood on the wall. but you have not seen that scene happen yet. And then it cuts to a wide shot, and Miki's not there, and it recuts back to the same shot you previously saw with Miki's body by the thing, and it's not there anymore either, because now you're fully in the first time she confronts Alba without necessarily knowing there's a second time, but that is a hint that, like, there is something else going on here. There's a duality of things occurring, as you have seen throughout the movie. And then, of course, you get, after you get all the stuff of Koto showing up, and as Injo's sneaking in, and he confronts Alba, and can do absolutely nothing against him because he's just a dude. And, like, Alba's like a crazy mage man with a top hat, and, like, is murdering people. And then you get these shots of Toko driving up, but you also don't know. We've had so much weird time fuckery so far with the edit, it's not clear. But one of my favorite sequences of shots is you have this, like, weird aerial shot of the cars parked outside of, like, on the street outside of the mansion. And it's like Toko's red car is there. Miki's car drives up, and then you get, like, a shot of, like, oh, there's a second red car there, and I think it repeats one of the earlier shots, and then Toko's second red sports car that Toko has drives up. A detail I love is that apparently she, not only are there two Tokos, she bought the same car twice, the exact same red sports car, because she drives up and creates this cool symmetrical image of, like, this top-down shot of, like, the exterior of the whole mansion complex with these two cars, but because it's, like, bordered on either side by the same red sports car, it, like, is this purely symmetrical shot. It's a really good little sequence that cues you in on there's something weird going on here, and then Toko comes in, she unleashes a demon in her little suitcase, kills Alba brutally with it, and you find out that she had made a puppet, an identical puppet of herself, one that is completely indistinguishable from the real thing. And I think, like, part of, like, her whole she has no ambition is that once she has done that, it means, like, she needs no ambition anymore. It's pointless. Because she doesn't need to do a thing. Because if she doesn't do the thing, then her clone, basically, that she's made will just do that thing. And it, like, creates this weird paradoxical loop of where it's like, well, I don't need to ever do anything anymore. And I think that's part of her making this new version of herself, allowed her to, like, logic herself almost in a very Toko-esque fashion out of the need for an ambition to greater things. And that, so we never find out, because I don't think it's supposed to be important. It's meaningless. If they're completely indistinguishable, what does it matter? But we never find out which one is the original Toko, which one is the quote-unquote puppet Toko. For all we know, the original Toko is fucking dead as shit, and we are with a, like, different puppet version of Toko that just has the same memories, and is identical in every other way. But it's that kind of, like, philosophical concept. But I love it. Toko is, like, one of those badass characters in any of this stuff. This is, like, the big moment for me with her, is, like, you can rip her fucking heart out, you can destroy her heart, you can rip her fucking head off, and you still can't kill her, because she's just going to come back anyway. And it's not like a, time travel nonsense, or it's not an illusion. She's a fucking video game character. She just has a second life. It's like too bad, guys. It's like I got a 1-up, I got 1,000 points a few days ago. It's like, you fucked up, because now I can just show up and ruin your shit.
What if this is how the Super Mario movie represents that concept? Is you have Mario gets fucking ripped apart by Bowser in one scene, and Luigi's on the ground crying, and Bowser crushes Mario's head that he ripped off the body, and then Mario comes back in and says, "It's-a me! I had a perfect clone." That'd be great.
Yes. I made a puppet of myself. Yeah.
No, I love it, and it's like, this is the kind of concept that you could devote several 2-hour movies to on its own, right? And it's just one small part of this film, right? And it's something that, we're spending more time talking about it than the movie spends dwelling on the metaphysics of it, right? Uh-huh. It's a very simple explanation. Like, you learned earlier that Toko, her, like, magic ability was puppets and the manipulation of puppets, and that's the thing she was so good at. And at the point where you have created a perfect, identical clone of yourself, like, there are no more puppets to make, right? She has done whatever the top ambition was. She has done it. It's like if you were a doctor and you solved all forms of cancer. It's like, well, I did it. I beat medicine. It's like she did the thing. And so now you have this, and the movie just kind of moves on from that idea. As you say, I hadn't even really thought of the idea, Sean, of, like, which one's the original and which one isn't, and I love that the movie doesn't even invite discussion of that. It is just, here they are. And of course, the reason it works so well is because this is so a movie about duality. This is, the idea is everywhere. It is the yin-yang. It is the idea of a paradox. It is the idea of a spiral. It is the idea of a cycle. It is the idea that, like, the introduction of the plot point that she has lived because she cloned herself is through a series of shots that are identical repetitions of shots you saw earlier, which when you see freak you out because they are so deja vu, you know? It's And as you were explaining it, it's not even that simple because it's not quite repetitions, it's like we caught back up to the initial shots that we saw because the edit is so complicated.
Yes. It's like, I mean, it's like a 30-minute something stretch of the movie before you get back around to that brief thing you saw where it's like, was that Cocteau on the ground bloody? Like, what the fuck was that? Like, brief thing you saw, and then you've got to, if you're, watching it, I mean, obviously I knew this stuff, but if you're watching it for the first time, you notice that, like, you got to hold that in your brain for like 30 minutes before it comes back up again. But it's part of the whole, because that's not the only time they do something like that. That's like in every other scene. There's a detail like that is slightly out of place because it is a different version of that scene that has happened either later or earlier than where you think you're supposed to be in the timeline. While we're on Toko, I do also want to bring it because you have the screenshot and it's an amazing moment where she says, as she kills Elba, she says, "I've made it a rule that I have annihilated everyone who called me the disgraced Scarlet."
Yes.
And I love even like the word annihilated honestly doesn't even get across. She uses she says buchi korosu in Japanese, which is just like basically you would be fairly well justified. You could make a clear argument for translating that line as like, I fucking murdered everyone who called me the disgraced Scarlet. That's like, it's like buchi korosu is such a kind of vulgar word. And I love it. Again, it's so suggestive that's the person that she was before she let go of all these things. She was this much more cruel, much more unforgiving, much harsher person before all this stuff and before her letting go and her living this life that she now has. And they went just a little bit too far and they poked the nest a few too many times and this is what comes out. And I love that, Soren clearly knew that all this was up because he because the scene that sets up that line is that Alba says that when in the room with the decapitated Toko head, and he uses that nickname and Soren's just like, "Oh, you should have said that." Basically, it's like, "Oh, you really should have said that." It's like, you can take the head, man. It's yours. Like, you can do whatever the fuck you want with it, but you shouldn't have said that shit. And Soren clearly knows that probably Alba's going to get murdered, but he's just like, okay, you take that head. It's what you said you wanted. It's why you helped me out with this thing. You can have the head. I'm going to do my shit. But you shouldn't have said that shit, man.
It's fucking great. Another Toko moment that we can move on, and we can move on after this, is she has this scene where she's talking to Soren, and this precedes right after this is when she gets stabbed through the heart. But she gives her 3 laws of monsters. I like to think of this as our corollary to Asimov's 3 laws of robotics is Toko's 3 laws of terror. She says, "Araya, there are 3 elements that terrorize people. Do you know them? 1, a monster should not talk. 2, a monster's identity should never be revealed. 3, a monster is meaningless if it is not immortal." I love that. I feel like someone should build a literature class about monster horror around Toko's 3 laws and see if it holds, because I think it sounds pretty smart to me.
Yes, because it's the whole thing of if it is knowable, it can be killed. I think it's I think it kind of connects to Shiki's whole thing with the mystic eyes of death perception is if you're a thing that she can identify and understand and conceptualize as being alive in a thing, an entity, you are something that can be killed by her. And so it's as he becomes more humanized in his existence, he becomes more vulnerable. And if he's talking, if he's out there and everybody knows who he is making himself more and more vulnerable. And if he wants to be a true monster, he needs to be totally closed off and alien and inscrutable. And then perhaps he would be able to survive an encounter with Shiki. But it's at this point, I think Toko knows very well, this dude's fucked. There's no way he's given away too much already at this point that eventually Shiki's going to get to him. And
Shiki gets to him well and good, and I love in this final moment when Toko realizes that Shiki is coming, basically, and she acts like the greatest hype man in the history of, wrestling or pro sports or something, of like hyping up the appearance of Shiki, including, I think, one of the most badass lines in the entire series where she says, "We, the Magi, are threats to logic, but Shiki is the Grim Reaper to non-logic." That is a fucking phenomenal line.
Yes, because it's like, because then after that she says, like, you would have been better off, like, caging her in a cage of concrete. Because what he's done is, like, he's, like, magically imprisoned her in, like, a different space, right? He's created some sort of, like, magical boundary that in other space or dimension or something that she's trapped in, using magic, which for any normal person, that would be the most surefire way to keep them in prison. But because Shiki is Shiki and she has her capacity, she can cut anything if she can conceptualize it as a thing that is finite. Her ability to destroy magic is something that, like, nobody else can do it as well as she can, right? She can cut through non-logic or, like, unreality, which is something that nobody else can do. So if he had made it a concrete prison, it would have been harder for her to escape. But because he's a mage and because he thinks in those terms, and he thinks that his advantage over people is the, like, abstract and the conceptual and the magical and the fantastical, that's what he uses. It's like, that is the wrong approach with Shiki. That is the exact things that she can destroy.
And I also love the idea that, Enjo goes into the building with the goal of he's going to get the sword to Shiki. And the initial idea by Kokuto is that she's in room 410, you're going to go there, you're going to give her the sword. And Enjo even has this kind of realization of, I don't have to physically go there. I've brought the sword far enough. And he does his final thing and sacrifices himself. And then Shiki just appears and has the sword. And it's just such a great series of images. And then you get the absolute craziest thing that Ufotable has produced thus far, in their time as a studio, which is this final fight.
Yeah. Well, before the final fight, you get, I think it's the thing we alluded to earlier, you get this interesting montage that's from effectively Shiki's perspective, where she has some kind of moment of revelation that, like, I interpret as, like, I think, like, two things. One, that in the metaphysics of this specific fantasy setting, like, she has, like, brushed up against the root in some way, right? Like, it's the reason why she's there. Her mystic eyes of death perception, right? The whole thing that Soren's trying to do is that her mystic eyes of death perception gives her a closeness to the root, because death is an absolute. It exists in all things. She's able to perceive and touch the, like, manifestation, the conceptual manifestation of death. That brings her close to the root, and that's what he's trying to use. He's trying to occupy her body, also then, like, combining a yin and yang, a male and female, all that kind of stuff, in order to reach the root. And so I think that moment where you get the movie played in fast forward, basically, but in chronological order, is her touching the root and having this, like, epiphany of all these moments, even ones that she was not present for that she's able to see. But I think it also represents, in the yin yang sense, her momentarily either becoming, or again, like, maybe brushing up against the taiji or the taikyoku, or what they translate here as the supreme ultimate, which is the yin yang as a whole, right? Like, the yin and yang symbol is not a symbol of two things. It is one unified symbol of these two things in balance. That is one great unified whole. That is the supreme, quote unquote, the supreme ultimate, as they say here. That is what Shiki is meant to be. That is part of her dual personalities, all that kind of stuff. She's meant to be someone who becomes this thing. I think this is, like, her brushing up against that moment and being able to create meaning out of the disordered chaos we have gotten so far. And that is what, like, precedes her manifesting there.
And I think gender is a big part to talk about here, too.
Yes.
Because this movie does come back to the gender conversations in several places. Tomoe Enjo mentions it several times. And then there's this scene between Toko and Kokuto in the middle of the movie where, Toko says, "You love her regardless of her gender." And he says, "Yeah, I guess I do." And Toko asks directly, "Would you care if Shiki was male?" And Kokuto thinks about it and says, "Well, I'd prefer female, but it's fine then. It doesn't matter." And Toko is thinking that, well, she's already kind of combined because she's female in the body, but speaks masculine to make up for the dead Shiki, the other personality, the male, personality. And part of Enjo's whole plan is, or not Enjo's whole plan, Soren's whole plan, as you were talking about, Sean, is the he's male, she's female, this will create a yin-yang. But part of why that plan will never work is she's already that yin-yang. And I feel like in that moment, and when she comes back into being at the end of this movie, it is this symbolic completeness of there has been this kind of like, you know, she came into some understanding of it in movie 4 when she gets out of the coma and gets the powers and all that stuff and starts adopting, you know, the male shiki speaking style and whatnot. But there is still this sort of like, where is she going to land on this sort of spectrum? And where she lands is like in this middle position where she is both things in one, comfortably so. And, you know, she even comes out in a different like colored kimono than she had before, which is obviously notable. And this is where, again, it just feels the normal he, she pronouns feel completely inadequate for discussing this. But it's part of what makes it so compelling.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, again, this is like part of the duality thing that has been a motif across all of the movies. Obviously, the yin-yang thing has been in all the movies. It's one of the main motifs of the whole series. And it's, you know, and we're still not done with it because we've got 2 other movies to go. But it does reach a big climax here where I don't think, you know, partially this is because I know where some things go. Like, you know, Sheik is not fully settled there yet, but she's like touched it. Right. She hasn't, you know, it fully accessed the root. She hasn't seen all of the knowledge and whatever of like all of existence and everything that has been and ever will be. But she brushed up against it to see this moment, this sequence, this year, whatever it is, how much time, and see it in its totality and understand it in its totality and be able to see the like perversion in this like gut way of what Soren is. Right. She says this line that I love, when she gets the sword and she stumbles towards him. That's like, it's weird. Because she says, it's weird. I should be excited because I know I'm going to be able to like fight you in the most extreme way, like push myself to the absolute limits in fighting you. But all I am obsessed with now, or I'm filled with, is this like, I cannot tolerate your existence, is basically what she says. It's not that I want to kill you, it's that I cannot tolerate your existence. And that she takes no pleasure in it anymore. She's not having fun killing him. It's that she just can't permit him to exist anymore because he is a perversion in reality and must be like snuffed out effectively.
It's unbelievable. It's so good. And then, of course, the action sequence that follows, we've already talked about it, but the way the camera goes into the animation is just a cut above even what we've seen so far, even earlier in this movie, and it blew my fucking mind away.
Yeah, there's a fascinating sequence in the middle of it where the camera like moves in literally like physically between the 2 characters and is like spinning like it's in a spiral effectively between the 2 characters and like almost like going upside down and stuff and shifting its perspective on them. That is like a shot I've never seen in anything else before. I mean, it's something that with an actual real world physical camera would be impossible to do without it being fucking smacked and broken by the actors. Like you would be able to fit it in there. And so it's like taking advantage of this 3D camera. And this is the shot that I've seen like the animatics for and know that they like conceptualized it and prototyped it with 3D models that then was used as reference to the 2D animators because it's like such a complex camera movement. And it's the most experimental they've been with any of that kind of stuff in the movies we've seen so far.
So it is essentially hand-drawn images, but taking as their model, almost like in a rotoscope kind of sense, this 3D modeled animatic that they did.
Yeah, more or less. And the background is a 3D background, right? So like what we've seen in other places here, like the rooftop in movie 1 and later in Kimetsu no Yaiba, where they like to use the 3D backgrounds because it makes the animation a lot easier because you don't have to try to redraw the background for the different camera angles. But
even in this, they've I think even stepped up from some other moments in Kara no Kyoukai where the background they've finished it with hand drawn image and like the way it's melding background art with the 3D model. The illusion of it all being like planar 2D images that have like come to life somehow is so totalized here in a way that reminds me of like Kimetsu no Yaiba episode 19 when Tanjiro achieves the, Hinokami Kagura and just jumps into motion and your jaw drops because it doesn't feel like we've put one animation style down and picked up another, which is what you would often get. It's like that one animation style leapt into a kind of motion that it shouldn't have been capable of, right?
Yeah. There's like, it feels like a magic trick.
Yes.
And it's like And it's interesting that, like, every time they do it, it still feels like a magic trick. When you have seen it 1,000 times, it still feels like a magic trick. And then the first time they've done it here, effectively the first time, it still has that magic trick quality to it, where you're just like, how the fuck do you do this? Like, how do you conceptualize this? How do you execute this? Like, everything about how it comes to life is just crazy.
So, can we do a deep dive on the final scene of this movie? Because it's my favorite scene in Kara no Kyoukai so far.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of my favorite endings to any movie I've ever seen. That's been true forever, since the first time I watched it. The dream that, the thing we come to realize is this dream that Shiki has of this symmetrical cafe with her and Enjo there sitting back to back, them getting up to leave as the music swells, and then her getting shocked awake by the sound of, like, the knocking on the door that we know must be Kokuto, her saying he's a wimp, and then hearing the sound of the key, like, moving in the lock and the door becoming unlocked and opening, and her sitting up awake and it smashing to black. It's just a perfect movie ending. Everything that is amazing about the movie and its themes and its ideas and its motifs is all encapsulated, I think, in those last, like, 3 minutes.
Yeah, I just want to go through the succession of shots because it is so, and I have them all here in the screenshot folder, Sean, but it is so perfect. You start with this shot of the big, circular building, the Paradox Mansion, with, it is glowing orange with all the other lights of the city, and there's snow falling down. And then you cut to Toko taking a drag from her cigarette. You have the smoke from her
cigarettes,
cigarette.
By the way, this is a detail I didn't notice the first time I watched the movie. Those are the cigarettes that the first Toko gave Kokuto, those cigarettes, as like a lucky charm that then she pulls from his jacket pocket.
Yes.
So those are like the ones that she gave, the first one of her gave to Kokuto, that now the second one of her took from him when he was unconscious. I don't think I ever noticed that detail before. And that is, like, incredibly funny to me, that she is, like, through him as a middleman, has passed herself her own packet of cigarettes.
And they're the yin yang cigarettes. They have the word fate on them. They have, it's symbolic, you could say.
Yes,
but yes,
it's very good.
So you have her taking a drag. You cut to a reverse shot of her holding the cigarette. The smoke billows up. We pan up, and you have the smoke cutting through the snow at night. Beautiful, beautiful shot, which then graphic matches to you're in this cafe, and you have a close-up on the tea, and the steam is rising out of the tea, and it's a perfect graphic match to the smoke rising. But now we are in this, like, otherworldly liminal space cafe. Even this first shot is like a good, dual split down the middle image, because you have the tea in the middle, you have a menu behind it, you have honey on the left, you have a coffee pot on the right, so this perfect rule of thirds kind of image. Then you cut to, you have a Shiki in one booth, you have Tomoe in the other booth, their backs are to each other, you have the booth down the exact middle line of the shot, so again, these perfect symmetries, their, backs are to each other. Then you have this incredible long shot where you're at the other end of the cafe, and there's this line going down the cafe, and it's perfectly, you realize it's not a cafe that they're split across. It's like the same cafe in a mirror, basically, because you even have this one patron who at the front is just mirrored, like it's almost like a Rorschach kind of image, just unfolded at the middle. And then you go back in close, and you have a shot right on Shiki as she looks out the window, and she sees this shadowy figure beckoning, almost like an afterlife, or like beckoning you back to life or to the afterlife or something. And then you go back, and you're on Shiki, and you see Tomoe start to rise, and then you look in the other direction, and there's another figure with the opposite arm raised, so another shadowy figure beckoning him. And then there is this moment of recognition where he's going to leave, and then you go back to that long shot of the whole cafe in parallel. They both stand up, they're going in opposite directions. You have then this shot where, like, the spatial dimensions of the scene are kind of like broken at this point, which is so perfect, where they're in this like white space. They both have a door in front of them. You're cutting back and forth on like front facing shots of them, and they both are going to enter their doors. They turn to see each other. They have this final exchange of smiles to each other, and then it is this incredible experimental avant-garde image of, you just have these two parts that are like, it's almost like a split screen effect, but there's no like blank space between them. You just have the two images of each of them with their hand reaching out for a doorknob, and the like wrists match up, and so it is this like Rorschach image where you have the same thing at the center coming out and like unfolding, and it's each of them turning the knob, and as they turn the knob, Shiki wakes up, which is one of the first shots in the entire movie, is when you have Kokuto taking his driving lessons, and he puts the key in the ignition, and that key in the ignition becomes the key in the lock, which wakes up Shiki, which we now come back to as the final image of the movie. And as you say, Sean, she says the line, and then door opens, and we know he's coming in, and we cut to black, and we get an amazing Kalafina song, and yes, one of the best endings to a movie ever. Unbelievable.
It's amazing. Yeah, because also this is where you get this incredibly haunting version of the main Shiki theme that plays over this, and it's like it starts to swell when they both get up and stand to walk to their respective doors, and they start walking in slow motion because like the ethereal music like demands it, so everything slows down. There's one shot that or like sequence of shots you don't have here that is in your screenshots, is that they both turn to look at each other. And then they turn back, put their like hand up in a like over their shoulder, like I'll see you later kind of thing. And and it's all like Injo, does that first. Like she turns around to look at him. He looks back at her. He turns back and throws his hand up. She turns back and throws her hand up. They both go to the doors. Like in this like mutual recognition and this like parting of ways that then you're just ripped out of that moment, as she is when she wakes up, right? Because the music swells but isn't like swelling to a quiet moment or something. It feels like it's going to climax as the doors are going to open, and you are like jartled out of that dream like state by the same thing that is jartling Shiki awake in her apartment. It's just, there's something so perfect about the whole sequence, and I think there's so many different ways that you can read what is happening here, because I think you can read two things in this Shiki. You can read either that this is our Shiki and she is saying goodbye to Injo. I think you can also read this as being the dead Shiki, that they are both like either like this is a Shiki that is living, that is choosing to go back to the land of the living, and as Injo goes in this opposite direction to the land of the dead, or this is both of these ghosts both going off the land of the dead. I think both are like kind of legitimate. I've seen both as legitimate interpretations, partially because he arguably is wearing this red kimono that is a different kimono that you typically see Shiki wearing. I think that's what I've seen people say, that this is the male one. But I very much interpret this usually as this is the female Shiki. This is like a parting, in like at the boundary, right? Like literally at the boundary of nothingness. He is going to one end, she is going to the other, because they are opposites, right? Injo is a person who was like alive, living in a dead body for the whole movie, right? He was like alive on the inside. He was animated by this like need to live, this drive to live, a drive so intense that he killed his mother. In one of these cycles, he killed his mother because he needed to live so bad. He couldn't die one more time, but he's in a corpse the whole time. Whereas Shiki is a person who is alive on the outside, is in a living body, but is dead inside, or has been dead inside. And she's trying to find a meaning. She's trying to find something to live for. And so they are mirror reflections of both of them represent both sides, right? The one of, yin and yang is many dualities. It's not just good and evil. I think that's the thing that gets like simplified so much when it gets talked about, particularly in like a American context, is people just think like, oh, yin is good, yang is bad. It's like white and black in that way. That's like it's supposed to be that all things or most things exist in a state of dualities. It is male and female. It's open and closed. It's life and death. It's not just good and evil. And that they both are like exist on that boundary between these two states of the yin and the yang. And both of them have to like choose to go fully over in this moment to one side or the other. She has to choose life, has to go to, choose actively to like be alive. And that's when Kokuto is able to come back into her life and kind of fill that hole that was in her for the whole movie. And Injo has no choice because, he has spent himself. He must now go off to the land of the dead. I think it's just like this scene has always just hit me very hard because I think it encapsulates so much of like the ideas about like what it means to like live with death and have like death be a part of your life. That is, that theme that is throughout all of Kata no Kyoukai. I think it really sort of like culminates in this very poetic moment here.
Yeah, I don't know if I have much to add to that, because that is my reading, but you have even more perspective on this to give. But that's totally what I felt, is that they are going to different places, one back to the world of the living, one to the world of the dead, but they are similar journeys. They are mirrored journeys. They are, but in some sense, if this movie has introduced the idea of the root, the vortex, but no, the root, right? Yeah. And they're both in their own ways going back to it, right? Like, these are both ways to access and to come to it. Death is maybe the ultimate way of rejoining that, but also Shiki going out and living and continuing to strive is also that. And I think in some sense, with the way this movie is built, duality, and with that much more fulsome understanding of yin yang, as you're saying, Sean, it is the same movement. It is the same motion, even if it is to what we think of as very disparate places, life and death as opposites. Well, life only has meaning because of death, and death only has meaning because of life, and so this is a very real illustration of that. And every one of these movies, to some degree, is about how Shiki is touched by the encounter with the character or the victim at the center of the case or whatever in that movie. In the first movie and the third movie, it's the person in the case. In the second movie, it's Kokuto. In the fourth movie, it's sort of herself, right? And in this one, it's Tomoe. But this is the most profound version of that, because you have this sense of her awakening back to the world, deeply touched by this. And then, of course, if she's going to go back and actually live in this living body, what's the first thing that happens? What's the thing that calls her back? It's Kokuto coming. And of course, in the post-credit scene, she gives him the key, or she asks for the key. And I think my reading that Ufotable choosing to start their adaptation in episode 1 with that first scene of Kokuto trying to get her out of her shell with the little gift of ice cream being a little synecdoche for the whole series. I think that reading is holding up as I'm going further into this series, because that is what the series is about to some extent.
Yeah, absolutely. And just like that power of like the key and the lock as a symbol, right? That because I like the movie turns, I think, your like sort of conventional logic on its head, that like usually that as a symbol is like a negative one. It's about like keeping people out, it's like locked doors prevent people from coming in. But I like what it's like here. It's about like, no, locked doors are about letting people in and then like keeping them safe there. It's about like, you choose who gets to come into your life, and you choose like that they get to be there. That you get, and that you live with them, and you choose the people who are your family, right? The people who are your family are the people that have the key to where you live. I think there's something so beautiful about that message that, again, is very different to how I think like locks and keys and doors feel like they're usually used in these kinds of things. And there's the amount of intimacy, as we talked about earlier in the post-credit scene, the amount of intimacy there is in this idea of giving a key to someone. That obviously in the real world also is like an intimate thing, but it's given so much weight and so much power here because of the journey we've been on with Enjo Tomoe and like what all of that meant to him. I mean, the thing that brings them together at the beginning of the movie is that while he's running away from the bullies or whatever, he bumps into her in the alleyway, dropping his key on the ground, and then like he just keeps running, not realizing that his key is dropped to the ground, and Shiki picks it up, and she goes and finds him to give him his key back. And that's like why she goes into that weird like parking garage thingy to go and encounters like the whole fight. And so that the imagery of the key and the idea of the key is the thing that has permeated the whole movie. It is what brought our two characters together. It's like effectively the inciting incident for Shiki entering the plot of the film.
Which also pushes back against what Soren says to Tomoe, where he says, I even created your desire to be with Shiki, all of that. That's false. That's false. It was this little moment of chance that brought these two people together through the key.
Yes, yeah. It's either chance, or if you wanted like the spiritual side of it would be it's the counterforce or whatever. Yeah. It's like the world is pushing these people together because they need each other, and like them being together will like save the world, will like save these things. And I think both of those, however, like wherever your spiritual leanings are, you can read either one of those. It's either happenstance or it is like fated in some way. But yes, as you say, it is a thing where Soren is wrong, and basically Toko, that's part of what Toko's saying that to him of like all this failed because he escaped. I think is also telling us like no, Soren didn't really either. Maybe he thought he implanted that thing, and maybe he thought that was like part of his whole strategy, but that's not really what happened here. That Injo did escape on his own, that he did break that cycle because he couldn't die one more time, because he loved himself and his family too much. And that's what drove him out of there. And then he happened to hit Nishiki, or he was fated to encounter her to bring all of this about to happen.
This is such a good fucking movie, Sean. Jesus Christ. And we've talked about it for 2.5 hours, and I like it even more the more we break it down, which is the ultimate mark of a great movie. Did you know there's a 13-episode TV edit of The Garden of Sinners? That one of the ways they got it down to 13 episodes is they just cut this movie entirely. What the fuck is the point of doing any version of Kara no Kyoukai where you don't do this?
Yeah, I've never seen any of the TV edit. I've never heard it being held in any sort of regard whatsoever, because I think that happened in like also it was part of it was like the build up to them doing the 8th movie and stuff.
Right. It was essentially a promotional thing. They reconstructed the story chronologically, and then they cut chapters 5 and 6. But it's just so funny because it's like, that is, I could see them re-editing this into a TV thing. I don't think it would be the best version of it, but crazier things have happened. But this is like so clearly the heart of the story, even having not seen the last 2 chapters.
Yes.
I just think it's like, again, at the end of this, there was a part of me that just felt like, oh man, what more is there left to say? And then, the intellectual part comes in, and then it's, well, there's the whole serial killer thing. There's, all this other stuff. And I'm excited to see it, and I'm sure it's going to be great. But it does feel like, especially with how poetic that final scene is, it's like, boy, it feels like they said everything. That's how good this is.
Well, I found an interview with Nasu where he talked about this is for obviously him writing the novels, but like one of his original sort of ideas was that everything that is the plot of this movie would have been combined with lots of the plot elements of what is the 7th story or whatever. That would be the ending, because he had the idea that Soren is like the ultimate bad guy. He's the one who sets into motion the first story, the 3rd story, and elements of what happens at the 7th story connected to things that happened in the 2nd story that you didn't realize are also connected to things related to Soren. So it's like the idea was that he's like the big mastermind villain. He's like the big bad guy. And so he was going to have him be the main villain of the last story and like tie up all the serial killer stuff and all that there. And he realized it was like too much. It was too busy. And that was actually more interesting to like separate that out, do it this way to have this be this like kind of big climax, and then have space to deal with like a kind of fallout and a little bit of a denouement structure, and move the serial killer stuff to have like a smaller thing for the 7th chapter or whatever. And so if this feels like it's like a climax or culmination, it's like kind of designed to be. And yeah, it is weird to imagine a version of the story that then cuts this out, because it's like this is effectively the ending in some ways. In like a more traditional way, this is like the quote-unquote ending of the story, because the ultimate big mastermind antagonist has effectively been dealt with, but there are like still things to deal with after that. And I think that's one of the things that's fun with Kara no Kyokai's episodic structure, is that I think it like gives it space to do that. Whereas if it was not, if it was a more traditional novel structure with one big overarching seamless plot, I think that would be a little bit of an awkward thing to do. But I think because you have this episodic structure, it means like, yeah, we can have like a kind of another adventure monster of the week kind of thing, which is movie 6. And then you get your like full wrap up in movie 7 and kind of finish it out. And then we get like our birthday cake or whatever. It's like our extra little present, which is what the 8th movie is, because that's like a thing they made after all of that, which is just gets to be fun too. So it's an interesting structure, but this is effectively the climax of the story.
And hell of a climax it is. I am very excited to watch movies 6 and 7 and see how this thing ends. And that is what we will be covering on the next episode of Japanimation Station. I cannot wait to record that.
Yes, and just like to say it again, so yeah, episode 6 and 7 will be for the next episode of the podcast, and then the one after that will be movie 8, along with all of the other extra shit. And basically all of it is on Crunchyroll. As far as I looked at Crunchyroll, I think it's all there. So all the other, like, here's like a little 30-minute epilogue or whatever, like all those things, we're going to cover that together with the 8th movie, because most of those things are made around with the 8th movie as well. So next time will be 6 and 7. After that will be movie 8 and all the extra stuff.
Wonderful. I am very excited to see what happens next.
Yes, it is. We still got a lot of good ahead of us.
Japanimation Station.